You've been taught to wait for closure, as if one final explanation can unlock your peace. But what if the person who hurt you cannot give what they do not have? What if their silence, their confusion, their avoidance, and their unfinished words are not doors you must keep knocking on, but signs that your freedom must come from within? How to stop needing closure? From people who cannot give it is not about pretending the pain never happened. It is about learning through Buddhist wisdom that your heart can heal even when the story ends without answers. Inner freedom begins the moment you stop asking wounded people to complete what your own awareness is ready to release. This is not just another lesson about letting go. This is a quiet return to yourself. Are you ready? Let's begin. Sometimes the hardest thing to accept is not the pain itself, but the silence left behind after it. The unanswered message, the conversation that ended too suddenly, the apology that never came. The mind keeps returning to the same memories, not because it enjoys suffering, but because part of you still believes there must be one final sentence that will finally make everything hurt less. And that is where this hidden struggle begins. A strange exhaustion begins to grow inside a person when their heart becomes trapped between what happened and what was never explained. The body moves forward, but the mind quietly stays behind, replaying old words like a tired actor forced to perform the same painful scene every night. Something deep inside keeps whispering, "Maybe if I understand it one more time, I will finally be free." But freedom rarely arrives through endless mental repetition. The silent addiction to one final explanation is one of the most invisible forms of emotional suffering because it does not always look dramatic from the outside. Most people continue working, smiling, answering messages, and living normal lives while internally carrying unfinished conversations that never stop echoing in the background. Sometimes it is an ex-partner who suddenly disappeared. Sometimes it is a parent who never explained their coldness. Sometimes it is a friendship that slowly dissolved without honesty. And sometimes it is someone who hurt you deeply, then acted as if nothing happened at all. What makes these experiences so painful is not only the event itself, it is the feeling of incompleteness. Human beings naturally seek emotional resolution. The brain wants stories to make sense. It wants causes and conclusions. It wants emotional wounds to close neatly like books with proper endings. But life does not always work that way. Some chapters end in confusion. Some people walk away without explanation because they themselves are confused. And the mind struggles to peacefully accept what feels unfinished. This is why people replay old conversations over and over again. They search for hidden clues inside old sentences. They reread messages. They analyze tone. They mentally reconstruct moments from years ago, trying to discover where everything changed. The mind becomes convinced that somewhere inside those memories lies the magical sentence that will finally bring peace. But most of the time, the search itself becomes the suffering. Buddhist teachings often speak about attachment as the root of inner pain. Many people think attachment only means clinging to people or possessions. But attachment also appears in the desperate need for certainty. The mind becomes attached to understanding. It believes peace can only exist after every emotional question is answered. And because life cannot provide complete answers for every wound, the mind remains trapped in resistance. This creates a painful emotional cycle. The more confused someone feels, the more they search mentally, and the more they search mentally, the more emotionally trapped they become. The brain begins treating old memories like unfinished business. Every quiet moment becomes an opportunity for mental replay. While showering, before sleeping, during lonely afternoons. The same conversations return again and again. Many people do not even realize how addicted they have become to this process because it disguises itself as healing. They think they are trying to understand, but in reality, they are feeding emotional attachment. They are reopening wounds every day while hoping the wound will somehow heal itself through repetition. This is why some people cannot emotionally move on even years after someone leaves their life. Time alone does not heal attachment. Time only passes. Healing begins when the mind finally stops negotiating with the past. One of the most difficult truths to accept is that closure is often a fantasy created by emotional pain. People imagine a perfect conversation where the other person suddenly becomes honest, self-aware, remorseful, emotionally mature, and capable of explaining everything clearly. But reality rarely follows this script. Many people cannot even explain themselves to themselves. They act from confusion, fear, avoidance, insecurity, or emotional immaturity. Expecting deep clarity from emotionally confused people often creates endless disappointment. Sometimes the person who hurt you genuinely does not understand why they acted the way they did. Sometimes they are too ashamed to face the truth. Sometimes they avoid difficult conversations because they cannot tolerate guilt. Sometimes they rewrite the story in their own mind because accepting responsibility feels too painful. And sometimes they simply lack the emotional depth needed to give meaningful closure. But the suffering mind keeps resisting this reality. It says, "No, there must be something I missed." So the replaying continues. A person can spend years mentally chasing a final explanation that does not exist. The Buddhist mind understands something most people overlook. Not every emotional wound can be solved intellectually. Some pain softens only when the heart stops demanding certainty from life. This does not mean suppressing emotions. It means learning to sit beside uncertainty without allowing it to consume your entire inner world. This is where true emotional maturity begins. Mature healing is not always satisfying. Sometimes it means accepting that confusion itself is the answer. Sometimes silence is the closure. Sometimes avoidance reveals more truth than words ever could. A person who disappears without explanation already explained something through their actions. A person who repeatedly lies already revealed their relationship with honesty. A person who refuses accountability already exposed their emotional limitations. But the wounded mind keeps searching because it believes clarity must come through words instead of patterns. One painful reason people become addicted to final explanations is because uncertainty threatens the ego. The ego wants control. It wants predictable emotional stories. It wants pain to feel reasonable and organized. Unanswered questions make the ego feel powerless. And human beings deeply fear emotional powerlessness. This is why sudden endings often create obsessive thinking. The nervous system experiences emotional shock when connection disappears unexpectedly. The brain begins scanning the past, trying to regain emotional stability. It searches for signs it missed. It searches for meaning because meaning creates the illusion of control, but overanalyzing rarely creates peace. It usually creates emotional exhaustion. The mind starts living in imagined conversations. A person mentally argues with someone who is no longer there. They rehearse speeches in the shower. They create fantasy apologies. They imagine finally being understood. And temporarily, these fantasies provide emotional comfort because they create the illusion of unfinished emotional energy being released. But once the fantasy ends, the emptiness returns again. This is why the cycle becomes addictive. The mind receives temporary relief through mental replay, then falls back into emotional pain afterward. So it searches again, it replays again, it imagines again, and slowly emotional suffering becomes a daily mental habit. Many people become so accustomed to replaying the past that they no longer know how to emotionally live in the present moment. Buddhist teachings constantly return to awareness because awareness interrupts unconscious emotional loops. The moment you truly notice the mind replaying the same painful scene for the 100th time, something important happens. You begin separating yourself from the mental addiction. You realize the replay is not solving the pain, it is feeding it. Awareness creates space. Without awareness, people unconsciously worship their pain. They build emotional rituals around it. Sad music, old photos, repeated memories, secret checking of social media, revisiting places connected to the past. None of these behaviors are necessarily wrong by themselves, but when done compulsively, they strengthen emotional attachment instead of releasing it. The mind begins treating suffering like unfinished homework that must constantly be reviewed. But healing does not come from perfect understanding. Healing comes from emotional release. This is why some people with very little explanation eventually heal deeply, while others who received long conversations and apologies still remain emotionally trapped. Closure itself is not the true healer. Acceptance is. Acceptance does not mean saying what happened was okay. It means accepting reality exactly as it is, instead of emotionally fighting what already exists. This is one of the hardest spiritual practices for human beings because the mind constantly argues with reality. It says, this should not have happened. They should have explained. They should have cared more. They should have understood my pain. And maybe all of that is true. But reality remains unchanged. The suffering grows when the mind refuses to emotionally stop arguing with what already happened. There is also another hidden reason people obsess over one final explanation. Sometimes they secretly believe the explanation will restore their self-worth. If the other person finally admits fault, apologizes correctly, or explains themselves clearly, then the wounded person feels validated. They feel chosen again, important again, seen again. But this creates dangerous emotional dependence because your peace becomes controlled by another person's awareness. Your healing becomes tied to someone else's emotional maturity. And if they never grow, apologize, or become honest, your mind remains emotionally imprisoned, waiting for permission to move forward. This is why Buddhism teaches inner freedom instead of emotional dependency. Inner freedom begins when your peace no longer requires participation from the person who hurt you. That realization changes everything. You stop begging emotionally unavailable people for emotional depth they do not possess. You stop forcing clarity from confused people. You stop searching for peace inside minds that are already lost themselves. And slowly, the addiction to one final explanation begins weakening, not immediately, not perfectly, but gradually. At first, the mind still tries to replay memories. Old emotional habits do not disappear overnight, but awareness allows you to notice the pattern earlier. Instead of drowning inside the mental loop for hours, you begin catching yourself sooner. You begin asking deeper questions. Is this replay actually helping me? Will another hour of analyzing change reality? Am I seeking truth, or am I seeking emotional control? Am I trying to heal, or am I trying to avoid accepting uncertainty? These questions create emotional awakening. One of the quietest forms of suffering is the inability to tolerate incomplete endings. Many people would rather continue hurting than accept uncertainty peacefully. But inner freedom requires learning how to survive emotionally without complete answers. And surprisingly, this becomes easier once you stop expecting life to provide perfect emotional conclusions. The truth is, many human beings leave relationships carrying their own unresolved pain, confusion, trauma, fear, and emotional blindness. Some people disappear because intimacy scares them. Some lie because truth threatens their self-image. Some avoid closure because accountability feels unbearable. Some remain emotionally vague because they genuinely do not understand themselves deeply enough to offer clarity. Their inability to give closure is often revealing their own inner chaos. This realization softens personal obsession. Not because their behavior becomes acceptable, but because you stop interpreting their limitations as reflections of your worth. You begin understanding that another person's confusion is not proof that you are unlovable. Their silence is not proof you are worthless. Their avoidance is not proof you deserved abandonment. Sometimes people hurt others simply because they are disconnected from themselves, and wounded people often create wounded endings. There comes a moment during healing when a person grows tired. Not dramatic exhaustion, spiritual exhaustion. The soul becomes tired of carrying the same emotional weight every day, tired of replaying conversations, tired of hoping for messages that never come, tired of mentally standing outside closed doors waiting for emotional permission to move on. That exhaustion can become the beginning of awakening, because eventually the heart quietly asks, how much of my life will I sacrifice waiting for answers from someone who may never give them? That question changes everything. For the first time, attention shifts away from the missing explanation and back toward your own inner life. You begin noticing how much beauty has been ignored while mentally living inside the past. How many peaceful moments were interrupted by emotional replay. How much energy was spent trying to solve emotional puzzles that have no solution. And slowly, the present moment begins opening again. This is why Buddhist teachings place so much importance on awareness, stillness, and non-attachment. Not because emotions are bad, but because unconscious attachment turns pain into identity. The mind becomes addicted to unresolved emotional stories because they create familiarity. Strange as it sounds, suffering can become emotionally comfortable after enough repetition. People begin introducing themselves internally through their wounds. The person who abandoned me. The betrayal I never understood. The apology I never received. But true healing begins when pain stops becoming the center of your identity. You are not the unfinished conversation. You are not the unanswered message. You are not the silence someone left behind. You are the awareness capable of witnessing pain without becoming consumed by it. And that awareness becomes the beginning of inner freedom. And slowly, a deeper realization begins to appear. Not everyone avoids closure because they do not care. Some people avoid closure because honesty would force them to confront parts of themselves they have spent years running from. The silence they leave behind is sometimes less about your worth and more about the war happening inside their own mind. That truth is uncomfortable because part of the heart still wants to believe that if they truly understood the pain they caused, they would come back with clarity, accountability, and honesty. But many people spend their entire lives avoiding themselves, and someone who cannot sit peacefully with their own emotions will struggle deeply when asked to face the damage they caused another person. Some endings leave behind more confusion than pain itself. A person disappears without warning. They become distant overnight. They slowly fade emotionally while pretending everything is normal. Their words become vague. Their explanations stop making sense. One day they speak with warmth, and the next day they act like a stranger. The mind naturally asks, why would someone do this? And this question quietly haunts people for years because human beings expect emotional experiences to follow logic. They expect that if connection was real, honesty should naturally follow. But emotional immaturity does not operate through honesty. It operates through avoidance. One of the most painful truths to accept is that many people would rather escape discomfort than face themselves honestly. Accountability forces a person to look directly at their contradictions. It forces them to see the gap between how they want to view themselves and how they actually behave. And for emotionally avoidant people, that inner confrontation feels unbearable. So instead of speaking clearly, they disappear. Instead of apologizing honestly, they become defensive. Instead of admitting confusion, they create confusion around others. Instead of facing guilt, they avoid conversations entirely. And the people left behind suffer because they keep expecting emotional clarity from someone who survives by emotionally hiding. This is why closure becomes difficult with emotionally unavailable people. Not because the truth does not exist, but because the truth threatens the fragile identity they have built around themselves. Some people spend years convincing themselves they are kind, loyal, emotionally mature, or honest. But when their actions hurt others deeply, facing that reality creates internal conflict. Psychologists sometimes call this cognitive dissonance. The mind struggles when behavior and self-image no longer match. And instead of resolving that conflict through honesty, many people unconsciously protect themselves through denial, blame shifting, emotional withdrawal, or avoidance. The human ego will often protect comfort before truth. This explains why some people suddenly rewrite history after relationships end. Someone who once said, "You meant everything to me," later acts as if the connection was meaningless. Someone who promised forever suddenly behaves cold and detached. To the wounded person, this feels cruel and confusing. But internally, the avoidant person may be trying to escape emotional guilt by emotionally minimizing the significance of what happened. Because if they fully acknowledge the depth of the connection, they must also face the depth of the pain they caused. And many people are not emotionally strong enough to do that. This is where Buddhist teachings become deeply important, because Buddhism teaches that unconscious people often create unconscious suffering. Most human beings are not fully aware of their inner fears, wounds, insecurities, or emotional patterns. They react automatically from pain they never healed themselves. A person who fears abandonment may abandon others first. A person terrified of vulnerability may disappear once emotional intimacy becomes real. A person carrying shame may lie because honesty threatens their self-worth. A person disconnected from themselves may create chaos everywhere they go, and unfortunately, wounded people often hurt others while trying to escape their own discomfort. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it changes how suffering is understood. Instead of endlessly asking, "Why would they do this to me?" awareness slowly begins asking, "What kind of inner confusion causes a person to behave this way?" That shift matters because it stops turning another person's emotional immaturity into proof of your unworthiness. One hidden reason people avoid closure is because closure requires emotional stillness. It requires sitting inside uncomfortable emotions without escaping. It requires listening to another person's pain without becoming defensive. It requires honesty strong enough to survive shame, regret, and responsibility. And many people have never developed that emotional strength. Some individuals learned from childhood to avoid difficult feelings entirely. Maybe they grew up in homes where emotions were ignored, punished, mocked, or suppressed. Maybe vulnerability felt unsafe. Maybe accountability always led to humiliation. Over time, avoidance became their survival mechanism. So when relationships become emotionally intense, their nervous system automatically seeks escape instead of resolution. This is why some people suddenly shut down during important conversations. They become emotionally numb, they change the subject, they disappear, they delay responses, they give vague answers. Their mind is not searching for truth. It is searching for relief from discomfort. And the tragedy is that the wounded person waiting for closure interprets this avoidance personally. They think, if I mattered enough, they would explain. If I were lovable enough, they would communicate. If I were important enough, they would stay. But most of the time, the avoidance reveals far more about the other person's emotional limitations than your value. Emotionally healthy people understand that endings deserve honesty. Even painful honesty creates less suffering than emotional disappearance. But emotionally avoidant people fear truth because truth forces self-confrontation. And self-confrontation is terrifying for people who built their entire emotional life around escaping themselves. There are people walking through life who have never sat alone quietly with their own emotions. They distract themselves constantly. Relationships, attention, work, entertainment, validation, social media, noise, movement, anything to avoid hearing the unresolved pain inside themselves. So when someone asks them for closure, they are not only being asked to explain the relationship, they are being asked to confront themselves, and that is why they run. Sometimes the person who hurt you genuinely knows they acted selfishly. They know they lied. They know they betrayed trust. They know they became emotionally distant without explanation. But admitting these truths would force them to experience guilt fully, and guilt feels threatening to fragile egos. So instead of processing guilt maturely, they unconsciously seek emotional escape. Some become cold because coldness creates emotional distance. Some become defensive because defensiveness protects identity. Some blame the other person because blame temporarily removes shame. Some vanish entirely because disappearance allows emotional avoidance. But none of these behaviors create peace internally. Avoidance only delays self-confrontation. The unresolved emotions remain buried underneath the surface, quietly shaping future relationships and future suffering. Buddhism teaches that unhealed attachment and unconscious fear continue repeating themselves until awareness interrupts the cycle. This is why emotionally avoidant people often repeat similar patterns across multiple relationships. Different faces, different stories, same emotional escape, and sadly, many never realize it. One painful mistake people make after abandonment is assuming the other person has found peace while they alone continue suffering. But external silence does not always mean internal peace. Many people look emotionally calm while internally carrying enormous confusion, shame, fear, emptiness, or emotional fragmentation. The difference is simply that some people process pain consciously while others run from it unconsciously. Running can look peaceful from the outside, but avoidance has consequences. A person who constantly escapes difficult emotions slowly loses connection with themselves. They become emotionally shallow because depth requires honesty. They struggle with intimacy because intimacy requires vulnerability. They struggle with consistency because consistency requires self-awareness. Eventually, their entire emotional life becomes built around temporary relief instead of genuine peace. And this explains why some people move quickly from one relationship to another after emotionally hurting someone. It is not always because they healed quickly. Sometimes they are simply distracting themselves from self-confrontation. Distraction is easier than awareness. A person can avoid silence for years, but eventually life forces everyone inward. Quiet moments arrive, loneliness arrives, aging arrives, regret arrives, and the truths people spent years escaping often return later with greater intensity. This is why Buddhism emphasizes awareness now instead of later, because suffering increases when truth is continuously avoided. The person seeking closure often believes they are the only one emotionally struggling. But emotionally avoidant people suffer too, though differently. Their suffering simply hides beneath numbness, distraction, ego, or emotional detachment. Some become experts at pretending nothing affects them because feeling deeply threatens emotional collapse. And unfortunately, modern culture sometimes rewards emotional avoidance. People praise detachment while secretly carrying unresolved wounds. They call avoidance moving on. They call emotional suppression strength. But true strength is not emotional numbness. True strength is the ability to face reality honestly without escaping yourself. That kind of honesty is rare. And because it is rare, many relationships end in emotional confusion instead of emotional clarity. There is another reason people avoid closure that few talk about openly. Sometimes giving closure would destroy the image they carefully maintained during the relationship. Honest closure may require admitting manipulation, dishonesty, selfishness, fear, cowardice, or emotional inconsistency. And some people protect their image more fiercely than they protect truth. This is why certain individuals become strangely cold after causing pain. They unconsciously distance themselves emotionally because empathy threatens the false story they tell themselves about who they are. If they fully empathize with your suffering, they must acknowledge their role in creating it. And many egos resist this deeply, but the wounded heart keeps waiting because it believes enough love, patience, or understanding will eventually make the other person emotionally honest. Unfortunately, emotional honesty cannot be forced. A person must choose self-awareness willingly, and many never do. This realization hurts deeply at first because it removes fantasy. The fantasy says, one day they will finally understand. One day they will explain everything. One day they will apologize sincerely. But reality is often less satisfying. Some people remain emotionally disconnected from themselves for years. Some continue repeating harmful patterns without reflection. Some spend their lives avoiding accountability entirely. And waiting endlessly for emotional maturity from someone committed to avoidance becomes its own form of suffering. At some point, healing requires accepting that another person's inability to face themselves cannot become the prison of your own inner life. This is where compassion becomes important, but not naive compassion. Buddhism does not teach blind tolerance for harmful behavior. It teaches understanding without hatred. There is a difference. Hatred keeps emotional attachment alive because the mind remains tied to the person through resentment. But understanding softens emotional obsession. You begin seeing human beings more clearly. You see how unconscious fear controls behavior. You see how unresolved wounds create destructive patterns. You see how ego protects itself through avoidance. And slowly, the emotional grip weakens. You stop chasing explanations from people who cannot even explain themselves honestly. You stop demanding emotional depth from emotionally disconnected minds. You stop expecting clarity from those who fear truth. And most importantly, you stop turning their confusion into your identity. This creates enormous emotional freedom, because the moment you realize another person's avoidance reflects their relationship with themselves, not your worth, the heart begins releasing unnecessary self-blame. You understand that someone can genuinely care about you and still lack the emotional maturity to handle relationships honestly. You understand that someone can fear vulnerability so deeply they destroy connection to avoid facing themselves. You understand that some people disappear not because you lacked value, but because they lacked inner stability. These realizations do not erase pain overnight, but they remove false interpretations that keep suffering alive. The mind no longer needs to obsessively solve the mystery because the deeper truth becomes visible. Emotionally avoidant behavior often grows from internal fragmentation, and fragmented people create fragmented endings. One of the quietest forms of wisdom is recognizing when clarity will never come from the source of confusion itself. That understanding changes how healing happens. Instead of standing emotionally outside another person's locked inner world, begging for explanation, attention slowly returns inward. You begin rebuilding connection with yourself. Your energy stops flowing endlessly towards someone emotionally unavailable. And this return inward matters deeply because healing cannot fully begin while the mind remains emotionally attached to forcing awareness from another person. The search for closure slowly softens when you stop expecting unconscious people to suddenly become conscious for your comfort. You begin seeing human suffering more clearly, the lies, the avoidance, the emotional inconsistency, the disappearing. Much of it comes from people terrified of facing themselves honestly. And strangely, this realization creates both sadness and peace at the same time. Sadness because you understand how much unconscious suffering exists inside human beings. Peace because you finally stop carrying responsibility for fixing what was never yours to fix. And eventually, another painful truth begins to reveal itself. Sometimes the deepest suffering does not come from the betrayal, the abandonment, or even the silence itself. It comes from waiting for accountability, waiting for recognition, waiting for the moment someone finally says, "I was wrong, and I understand the pain I caused you." But many people spend years emotionally trapped inside that waiting. A quiet heaviness begins forming inside the heart when an apology never arrives. Days pass, months pass, sometimes entire years pass, yet part of the mind still listens for the words that never came. Not because pride needs victory, but because the soul longs to feel seen. There is a deep human ache that appears when pain is ignored, as if it never mattered. And this is where emotional imprisonment quietly begins. The emotional prison of waiting for an apology that may never come is one of the most exhausting forms of attachment because it ties your inner peace to another person's awareness. Your healing becomes dependent on whether someone else grows enough to acknowledge reality honestly. And when they never do, the mind remains suspended between anger, grief, confusion, and hope. A person can continue living externally while internally waiting for emotional justice that never arrives. This waiting changes people slowly. At first, they simply want acknowledgement. They want the other person to recognize the damage they caused. They want honesty. They want emotional accountability. But over time, the waiting becomes heavier. The mind begins replaying scenes over and over, trying to mentally force an apology into existence. It says, how can they act normal after what happened? How can they move on without saying sorry? Do they even realize what they did to me? Do they even care? And underneath these questions lives something even more painful: the fear that your suffering was invisible. Human beings naturally want emotional experiences to be recognized. When someone hurts us deeply and never acknowledges it, the nervous system struggles to process the experience completely. The pain feels emotionally unfinished because accountability never arrived to validate reality. This is why missing apologies hurt more than people realize. An apology is not just words. A sincere apology says, I see your pain. I understand my impact. I acknowledge reality. You were not crazy for hurting. Without those confirmations, many people begin emotionally questioning themselves. They replay events repeatedly, trying to prove their own pain was real. And this becomes dangerous because self-trust slowly weakens. Buddhist teachings speak deeply about attachment because attachment often disguises itself as emotional fairness. The mind says, I deserve an apology. And sometimes that is absolutely true. But suffering increases when peace becomes emotionally chained to receiving what another person may never be capable of giving. This is one of the hardest spiritual truths to accept. Some people genuinely lack the awareness required for real accountability. Some are too emotionally immature to face guilt honestly. Some protect themselves through denial so deeply that admitting wrongdoing feels psychologically threatening. Some convince themselves they are the victim because accepting responsibility would collapse the fragile story they tell themselves about who they are, and others simply do not want to feel uncomfortable. So the apology never comes, not because your pain lacked importance, but because their awareness lacks depth. This distinction matters deeply because wounded people often internalize silence personally. They assume, if they cared, they would apologize. If I mattered, they would acknowledge the pain. If I were enough, they would try to repair things. But emotional avoidance rarely reflects another person's worth accurately. It reflects the emotional limitations of the avoidant person. Still, the heart struggles to release the hope, because deep inside, many people believe the apology will finally set them free. They imagine the exact moment. The message appears. The phone rings. The person finally admits everything honestly. The pain suddenly softens. The years of confusion finally disappear. But reality is more complicated than this fantasy. Even when apologies do come, they do not always heal what people expect them to heal. Some apologies arrive too late. Some are incomplete, some are manipulative, some focus more on removing guilt from the apologizing person than genuinely understanding the wounded person's pain. And some people apologize without truly changing at all. This shocks many people because they spent years believing the apology itself was the missing piece. But emotional healing cannot fully depend on another person's emotional evolution. If peace only exists after someone finally becomes self-aware, your emotional freedom remains permanently vulnerable. This is why attachment to apology becomes a prison. The mind stays emotionally connected to the person through expectation. Even if there is no communication anymore, the attachment remains alive internally. The heart secretly waits. Every unknown message creates hope. Every memory reopens the emotional wound slightly. Part of the nervous system remains emotionally unfinished, and unfinished emotional attachment drains enormous energy. Many people do not realize how much of their life becomes organized around this hidden waiting. They replay imaginary future conversations where the apology finally happens. They mentally prepare speeches. They fantasize about finally being understood. They wonder what they would say if the person came back tomorrow. Meanwhile, the present moment quietly disappears. Life continues moving while the mind stays emotionally frozen beside old wounds. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows whenever the mind resists reality. And one painful reality human beings resist deeply is this: not everyone develops enough awareness to face the pain they caused others. Some people go their entire lives avoiding self-confrontation. That truth feels deeply unfair because emotionally conscious people naturally assume everyone eventually reflects on their actions the same way they do. But awareness varies greatly between individuals. Some people sit alone questioning themselves, analyzing their behavior, and seeking growth after hurting others. Others distract themselves immediately, suppress guilt, rewrite stories, or emotionally disconnect completely. And the wounded person suffers because they keep projecting their own conscience onto someone who may not operate from the same emotional depth. This creates endless confusion. A deeply empathetic person cannot understand how another human being could hurt someone and remain silent afterward. Their own conscience would never allow it. So they keep searching for hidden explanations because accepting the simpler truth feels too painful. The simpler truth is that emotional awareness is uneven. Some people genuinely do not examine themselves deeply enough to feel the weight of their impact clearly. Others feel it briefly, then escape it through distraction, ego, rationalization, or emotional suppression. This does not make the pain less real. but it explains why waiting endlessly often creates greater suffering than the original wound itself. There is also another hidden emotional layer underneath the need for apology. Often the apology symbolizes restoration of dignity. A person who was abandoned, betrayed, manipulated, or emotionally dismissed wants acknowledgement because acknowledgement restores emotional reality. Without it, many people feel erased. This is especially painful after emotional abuse, betrayal, or sudden abandonment. The nervous system struggles not only with the pain itself, but with the lack of recognition afterward. It feels as if the entire experience became emotionally invisible, and invisibility creates deep loneliness. The heart begins craving emotional witness. This is why some people remain attached to toxic individuals for years emotionally. They are not only attached to the person, they are attached to the unresolved emotional reality. They want acknowledgement that what happened mattered. But Buddhism gently teaches something difficult, yet liberating. Your pain does not become real only after another person admits it. Your suffering was real the moment you experienced it. Another person's inability to acknowledge truth does not erase your reality. This realization slowly rebuilds self-trust, because healing begins when your nervous system no longer depends on external validation to confirm your inner experience. You stop needing emotionally immature people to certify your pain before allowing yourself to move forward. This shift changes everything internally. You stop standing emotionally outside closed doors, begging for recognition. You stop sacrificing your peace while waiting for someone else's conscience to awaken. You stop delaying your healing until another person becomes emotionally honest, and slowly, emotional energy returns back to you. This does not happen immediately. The attachment to apology can feel incredibly deep because the wound itself often feels deeply personal, especially when someone acted as though your suffering did not matter. That kind of silence can feel dehumanizing. Sometimes people even become angry at themselves for still caring about the missing apology years later. They think, why am I still affected by this? Why can't I let it go? Why does this still hurt? But the nervous system seeks emotional resolution naturally. There is nothing weak about wanting acknowledgement. The suffering begins when your entire emotional freedom becomes dependent on receiving it. That dependence quietly gives another person control over your inner life. This is why Buddhist teachings constantly point inward, not because external behavior does not matter, but because waiting for others to become conscious often delays your own liberation. Freedom begins when awareness returns to your own mind instead of orbiting endlessly around another person's limitations. One difficult truth many people eventually discover is that some individuals avoid apologizing because apologizing would force them to face shame they do not know how to handle. Shame is one of the most uncomfortable emotions human beings experience. It threatens identity directly. A person may unconsciously think, if I admit what I did, I become a bad person. If I fully face the damage, I will collapse emotionally. If I acknowledge reality, I must live with guilt. So instead of processing shame maturely, they escape it through silence. Some avoid you completely because your presence reminds them of what they do not want to confront within themselves. Others become defensive whenever the subject appears. Some minimize the damage. Some act emotionally numb. Some convince themselves you are too sensitive. Some twist reality until they can emotionally survive their own behavior. And the wounded person waits for awareness that may never fully arrive. This waiting creates spiritual exhaustion over time. Not dramatic exhaustion, quiet exhaustion. The kind where the soul becomes tired of replaying pain, tired of hoping, tired of mentally checking whether the apology finally arrived, tired of carrying emotional tension every day. At some point, the heart begins asking a different question. What if my peace cannot wait any longer? That question marks the beginning of liberation, because eventually a person realizes life itself is passing while they remain emotionally chained to another person's level of consciousness. Days continue, seasons continue, opportunities continue, beautiful moments continue. Yet internally, part of the mind remains sitting beside an emotional wound, waiting for someone else to acknowledge it. This realization feels heartbreaking at first, but it also awakens something powerful. It awakens responsibility for your own inner life. Not responsibility for what happened, not responsibility for another person's behavior, but responsibility for whether you continue sacrificing your peace, waiting for what may never come. This is where true healing begins, separating from emotional dependency. Buddhism teaches that attachment creates suffering, not because caring is wrong, but because clinging prevents peace. And attachment to apology is still attachment. It says, I cannot fully release this until they respond correctly. But what happens if they never do? Does your life remain emotionally paused forever? This question forces deeper awakening, because inner freedom cannot exist while another person's awareness controls your emotional state. Otherwise, your peace remains fragile forever. Anyone who refuses accountability gains unconscious power over your inner world. And many people unknowingly surrender years of emotional life this way. The heart slowly heals when it understands something deeper. An apology can be meaningful, but it is not the source of your worth. Accountability can help, but it does not define whether your pain mattered. Another person's silence may reveal their emotional limitations, but it does not determine your reality. This understanding restores emotional sovereignty. You stop waiting for permission to heal. You stop waiting for external acknowledgement before trusting your own experience. You stop allowing unconscious people to decide whether your suffering deserves compassion. And this creates enormous inner relief. Not because the wound instantly disappears, but because the emotional struggle against reality softens. The nervous system no longer lives in constant anticipation. The mind no longer circles endlessly around the same unanswered emotional need. Instead, awareness slowly returns to the present moment. You begin noticing life again, small moments, quiet mornings, conversations, breathing, rest, stillness. The emotional prison begins opening. And strangely, one of the most healing realizations arrives quietly. Sometimes the apology you waited for was never actually about words. Deep down, you were searching for peace, dignity, acknowledgement, and emotional safety. But those things can slowly be rebuilt within yourself. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. Because true inner freedom begins the moment your healing no longer depends on whether another person finally learns how to see clearly. And slowly, after enough waiting, enough replaying, and enough emotional exhaustion, another realization quietly begins to surface. Even when answers finally arrive, the pain does not always disappear. Even when you understand why someone hurt you, abandoned you, betrayed you, or became cold, the heart can still ache in exactly the same place. Because understanding is not always the same thing as healing. A strange sadness appears when a person finally realizes that knowledge alone cannot free emotional suffering. The mind spends so much time searching for explanations because it secretly believes clarity will remove pain completely. It believes that if everything finally makes sense, peace will automatically follow. But many people eventually discover something heartbreaking. Sometimes you can understand someone perfectly and still suffer deeply from what they did. And that realization changes the entire journey of healing. The ego often confuses understanding with emotional liberation Because the ego believes every wound can be solved intellectually. It treats emotional pain like a puzzle. It wants reasons. It wants causes. It wants complete psychological explanations for every betrayal, rejection, silence, and disappointment. The ego believes that once the mystery is solved, the suffering will disappear. But the heart does not always heal through logic. This is why people can spend years analyzing another person's behavior without becoming emotionally free from it. They learn attachment styles. They study trauma responses. They understand emotional unavailability. They recognize narcissistic patterns. They finally understand why someone behaved destructively, yet internally the wound still hurts. Because emotional pain lives deeper than intellectual understanding. This becomes one of the most difficult truths for deeply thoughtful people to accept. Intelligent people often become trapped in endless emotional analysis because the mind gives them temporary comfort. Analysis creates the illusion of control. It feels productive. It feels like healing. The brain says, if I just understand this fully, I will finally let go. But many people are not truly healing during this process. They are emotionally circling the pain while believing they are moving beyond it. The ego enjoys analysis because analysis keeps the mind active. It keeps attention focused outward instead of inward. Instead of fully feeling grief, disappointment, abandonment, loneliness, or heartbreak, the mind hides inside explanation. It studies the other person endlessly because explanation feels safer than emotional surrender. This is why some people become emotionally stuck for years while convincing themselves they are working through it. In reality, they are often avoiding direct emotional experience. Buddhist teachings speak often about the difference between intellectual understanding and deep awareness. Intellectual understanding happens in the mind. Awareness happens in the entire being. A person can understand suffering conceptually while still remaining emotionally attached to it internally. This explains why healing cannot happen through thought alone. Thought can explain pain, but thought cannot always dissolve attachment. For example, someone may fully understand that a parent acted cold because they themselves were emotionally neglected as a child. Intellectually, this explanation makes sense. Compassion may even appear. But emotionally, the inner child may still carry grief from years of feeling unseen. The explanation did not erase the wound. Or someone may understand that a former partner avoided intimacy because they feared vulnerability. They may recognize all the psychological reasons behind the behavior, but understanding the fear behind someone's actions does not automatically remove the heartbreak created by those actions, because the nervous system remembers emotional pain differently than the thinking mind does. The body stores experiences emotionally. Rejection, abandonment, betrayal, humiliation, emotional neglect, and sudden loss affect the nervous system deeply. This is why people sometimes continue feeling emotional pain long after the mind understands everything logically. And this confuses many people. They think, but I already know why this happened. I understand their trauma. I understand their fears. So why does this still hurt? Because emotional wounds are not healed simply by collecting explanations. Sometimes the ego becomes addicted to understanding because understanding delays grief. As long as the mind keeps searching for deeper explanations, it avoids fully accepting the emotional reality of loss. Endless analysis becomes a subtle form of resistance. The heart says, "This hurts." The ego replies, "Wait, let me analyze this more first." And so the emotional process becomes delayed. There are people who can explain every detail of a painful relationship perfectly while still remaining emotionally imprisoned by it. They know the psychology, they know the patterns, they know the reasons, yet they still obsess, still replay memories, still carry anger, still seek validation, still feel emotionally trapped. Because knowledge without emotional release can become another form of attachment. This is one reason Buddhism warns against over-identification with thought. The thinking mind constantly creates stories about suffering. It wants to organize pain neatly into explanations, because explanations make uncertainty feel less threatening. But healing often requires something much deeper than explanation. It requires presence. Presence means allowing emotional truth to exist without constantly trying to mentally control it. This feels terrifying for many people because the ego believes surrender equals weakness. The ego wants solutions immediately. It wants certainty. It wants emotional resolution through understanding. But some pain softens only when the mind stops fighting it intellectually. There is a hidden exhaustion that comes from overthinking emotional wounds constantly. The nervous system never fully rests because the mind stays active every day searching for meaning. Some people spend entire nights mentally reviewing conversations from years ago. They replay tone, wording, facial expressions, timing and reactions, trying to uncover the exact explanation that will finally make the suffering disappear. But suffering often deepens through this constant mental engagement. The brain becomes overstimulated emotionally. Every replay strengthens neural pathways connected to pain. Instead of dissolving attachment, obsessive analysis often reinforces it. This is why overthinking creates emotional fatigue. The mind begins carrying emotional noise constantly. Even peaceful moments become interrupted by sudden memories and mental analysis. The person cannot fully relax because part of the brain remains emotionally trapped inside unfinished emotional investigation. And sadly, many mistake this exhaustion for healing progress. Buddhist wisdom gently teaches something very different. True healing begins when awareness notices the suffering created by endless mental grasping itself. The issue is not only the original wound anymore. The issue becomes the constant mental struggle against the wound. This changes everything, because suddenly the focus shifts away from solving the past and toward understanding the present suffering being created internally right now. The ego hates this shift because the ego prefers external focus. It wants to keep studying the other person endlessly. It wants to keep searching for hidden answers. It wants to keep proving why the suffering happened. But awareness asks a different question. What is this endless searching doing to your inner peace? That question begins awakening deeper understanding. Many people believe they need complete understanding before allowing themselves to move forward emotionally. But often this belief hides fear underneath it. The fear says, if I stop analyzing, I will lose control. If I stop thinking about it, maybe what happened will feel meaningless. If I let go without complete understanding, maybe I am betraying my own pain. So the mind continues holding tightly to explanation. But healing does not dishonor pain. Healing honors pain by allowing it to soften naturally instead of endlessly reopening it mentally. One difficult truth is that human beings are too complex to ever fully understand completely. Even people themselves often do not understand their own motivations clearly. Human behavior is shaped by unconscious fear, childhood conditioning, insecurity, trauma, ego, emotional blindness, social influence, shame, attachment, loneliness, and survival instincts. Trying to fully explain every painful behavior perfectly is often impossible. Yet the ego keeps trying because uncertainty feels unbearable. This is why some people become trapped in endless emotional research after heartbreak or betrayal. They consume psychology videos constantly. They read relationship books obsessively. They search endlessly for answers online. And while some knowledge can genuinely help, there comes a point where information becomes emotional avoidance disguised as self-growth. Because true healing eventually requires stepping beyond thought. This is where Buddhist practices become powerful. Meditation, awareness, stillness, and mindful observation teach people how to sit beside emotional pain without feeding it mentally. Instead of constantly analyzing suffering, awareness simply observes it. At first, this feels uncomfortable. The ego becomes restless without mental stimulation. It wants to continue solving, replaying, analyzing, and interpreting. But slowly, awareness notices something important. Thoughts themselves often prolong suffering. The mind says, "Why did they do this? How could they hurt me? What did I miss? What if I had said something different?" And every question pulls emotional energy back into the wound again. But awareness quietly notices the pattern without becoming trapped inside it. This creates emotional space. For the first time, a person begins experiencing moments where pain exists without becoming their entire identity. They realize they do not need to solve every emotional mystery in order to breathe peacefully again. And this realization feels deeply liberating. One reason the ego clings so strongly to understanding is because understanding creates emotional superiority. The mind secretly feels safer when it can explain the other person psychologically. It says, "They acted that way because they were damaged. They were emotionally immature. They feared intimacy." And maybe all of that is true. But sometimes the ego uses understanding to avoid vulnerability. Explanation becomes armor. Instead of grieving openly, the mind hides behind psychological interpretation. This is why some people sound emotionally wise while still carrying enormous unresolved pain internally. True healing is usually quieter. It does not constantly need to explain itself. It does not obsessively replay the past. It does not require endless mental justification. Healing begins when the nervous system slowly stops living in emotional survival mode. And that process takes gentleness, not just understanding. Many people underestimate how deeply emotional pain affects the body. Chronic overthinking activates stress responses repeatedly. The body remains tense, sleep becomes difficult, breathing changes, muscles tighten, the nervous system stays hyper-alert. Emotional analysis may appear intellectual on the surface, but underneath it often lives physical suffering. This is why awareness of the body matters deeply during healing. Buddhist teachings often return attention to breathing, because breathing reconnects awareness to the present moment, instead of the endless mental world of explanation. The present moment becomes healing because it interrupts obsessive emotional time travel. The ego lives in past and future. Awareness lives here, and healing happens here too. Another hidden danger of confusing understanding with healing is that people sometimes remain emotionally connected to painful relationships through analysis itself. They continue thinking about the other person every day under the excuse of trying to understand. But emotionally, the attachment remains active. The relationship may be over physically, yet mentally it continues living constantly inside the mind. This prevents emotional closure from naturally forming, because attention is energy. Whatever the mind repeatedly focuses on gains emotional power internally. Endless analysis keeps emotional wounds alive much longer than necessary. This does not mean suppressing thought completely. Reflection can absolutely help healing. Understanding patterns can create awareness. Recognizing unhealthy behavior can prevent future suffering. But there is a difference between healthy reflection and compulsive mental attachment. Healthy reflection eventually creates peace. Compulsive analysis creates exhaustion. The body feels the difference immediately. One leads toward clarity and release. The other leads toward emotional looping, and awareness slowly learns how to recognize these differences. A profound moment often arrives during healing when a person finally admits, "I understand enough already." That sentence changes something internally because the search finally softens. The person stops demanding complete psychological certainty before allowing themselves to heal. They stop trying to decode every detail endlessly. They stop treating emotional pain like a mathematical problem that can be perfectly solved through thought. Instead, they begin allowing life to move again. This is one of the quietest forms of spiritual maturity, not needing every wound to become fully explainable before releasing attachment. The ego struggles deeply with this because the ego believes emotional safety comes through total understanding. But awareness discovers something much deeper. Peace comes not from controlling emotional uncertainty, but from learning to live gently beside it. This changes how suffering is experienced entirely. The heart becomes softer, the mind becomes quieter, the nervous system becomes calmer. Not because every answer finally arrived, but because the obsession with needing complete answers finally loosened its grip. And slowly, healing begins happening beneath thought itself, not through endless explanation, not through intellectual mastery, but through acceptance, presence, compassion, stillness, and emotional release. This is why someone can understand another person completely and still need time to heal emotionally afterward. Healing is not only about information. Healing is about allowing the body, heart, mind, and spirit to slowly stop carrying survival tension. And that process cannot be forced through thought alone. Eventually, awareness begins recognizing something deeply important. The endless search for understanding was often an attempt to avoid sitting quietly with pain itself. But once pain is finally allowed to exist without constant mental resistance, something surprising happens. It slowly begins losing its power naturally, not because it was solved intellectually, but because it was finally felt honestly, without endless grasping. And this becomes the beginning of real inner freedom. Continuing in the same style from your uploaded sample, and when the mind finally begins to see that understanding alone is not healing, a deeper question rises quietly inside the heart. What happens when there is no understanding at all? What happens when the answer never comes, the reason stays hidden, and the story remains open like a door swinging in the wind? This is where many people suffer the most, not because the question is too powerful, but because the mind refuses to let the question remain unanswered. There are questions that hurt at first because something painful happened, but they keep hurting because the mind keeps touching them. Why did they leave like that? Why did they change so suddenly? Why did they say those things and then disappear? Why did they act as if the bond meant nothing? Why did they never explain? At the beginning, these questions seem natural, even necessary. The heart is trying to find its balance. The mind is trying to make sense of emotional shock. But over time, if awareness does not enter, the question slowly becomes a room you live inside. And this is the Buddhist truth most people resist. Not every question must be answered for peace to return. Some questions must be held gently until they lose their sharpness. Some questions must be allowed to exist without becoming the center of your life. Some questions must be seen clearly as thoughts, not commands, because unanswered questions do not always destroy peace by themselves. The suffering grows when the mind says, "I cannot rest until I know." That sentence becomes the chain. The mind believes certainty is safety. It believes that if every confusing event can be explained, then the heart will finally stop trembling. But life is not built to satisfy every demand for certainty. People are complicated, memories are incomplete, emotions are messy. Some endings happen in silence. Some people leave without knowing how to speak honestly. Some wounds come with no clean reason attached to them. And yet the mind keeps demanding a complete answer from an incomplete world. This is where suffering begins to repeat itself. Buddhist wisdom does not ask you to pretend you do not have questions. It does not ask you to become cold, careless, or emotionless. It asks you to look closely at the way the mind clings. It asks you to notice when a question has stopped being a doorway to wisdom and has become a cage of pain. Because there is a difference between asking from awareness and asking from attachment. Awareness asks, then listens, then accepts what is available. Attachment asks, then demands, then suffers when life stays silent. Many people think they are searching for truth, but they are really searching for control. They want the answer because uncertainty feels too open, too vulnerable, too painful. The unknown makes the ego feel small. It reminds the heart that not everything can be managed, predicted, or repaired. So the mind keeps circling the same question, hoping that if it thinks hard enough, the discomfort of not knowing will disappear. But thinking does not always remove discomfort. Sometimes thinking protects discomfort and keeps it alive. This is why unanswered questions can follow a person for years. The person may grow older, meet new people, move to a new place, build a new life, and still carry the same question inside like a stone in the chest. Not because the answer is coming, but because the mind has not learned how to be at peace without it. There is a quiet strength in saying, "I may never know, and I can still be free." At first, that sentence feels almost impossible. The mind fights it. It says, "No, I need to know. I deserve to know. I cannot move on like this." And there may be truth there. Maybe you did deserve honesty. Maybe you did deserve explanation. Maybe what happened was unfair, careless, or cruel. But deserving an answer and receiving an answer are not the same thing. Life does not always give people what they deserve from others. So the question becomes, will you let the absence of an answer steal the rest of your peace? This is where inner freedom begins to take shape. Not in a loud way, not with dramatic strength, but in the quiet moment when you stop treating uncertainty as an enemy. You allow the unanswered question to sit beside you without letting it drive your life. You stop wrestling with the empty space. You stop trying to force meaning out of silence. You stop reopening your own wound just to check whether an explanation has appeared inside it. And slowly, something softens. The mind does not become blank. The past does not vanish. The memory does not suddenly become beautiful. But the relationship with the question changes. It no longer owns the whole room. It becomes one part of your experience, not the center of your identity. This is the beginning of peace. One reason unanswered questions hurt so deeply is because the mind mistakes uncertainty for danger. When someone leaves without clarity or behaves in a way that makes no emotional sense, the nervous system becomes alert. It searches for patterns. It scans the past. It tries to prevent future pain by finding the exact reason this pain happened. This is natural. The mind wants protection, but the same mind that tries to protect you can also trap you when it refuses to stop scanning. It keeps returning to old memories, not because there is still something useful to discover, but because it has not accepted that the answer may not be available. The search continues even after the search has become harmful. Buddhist practice teaches that peace often begins by seeing the difference between useful thought and repetitive thought. Useful thought gives insight. Repetitive thought gives exhaustion. Useful thought helps you learn. Repetitive thought keeps you circling. Useful thought brings the lesson closer. Repetitive thought keeps the wound alive. And many unanswered questions become painful because they have crossed that line. There comes a time when asking why no longer opens your eyes. It only tightens your chest. It no longer brings wisdom. It only brings tension. It no longer helps you grow. It only drags your awareness back into a moment that cannot be changed. That is when the question itself must be seen with compassion. Not attacked, not suppressed, not hated, just seen. You can say, "This question is here because I was hurt. This question is here because something felt unfinished. This question is here because my heart wanted care, honesty, and respect. But I do not have to feed this question forever." That kind of awareness is powerful because it does not deny your pain. It honors the pain without obeying every thought that rises from it. The mind will ask again, why did it happen? Why did they act that way? Why did they never explain? And each time, awareness can gently return. I do not know, and I do not need to punish myself for not knowing. This is not weakness. This is discipline of the heart. Most people think discipline means forcing yourself to do hard things outside. But sometimes the deepest discipline is internal. It is refusing to follow every painful thought back into suffering. It is refusing to turn uncertainty into endless self-torture. It is refusing to make your peace depend on answers that may never arrive. And this is where Buddhist wisdom becomes deeply practical. The Buddha often pointed to the suffering created by clinging. Clinging does not only mean holding on to people, it also means holding on to the belief that life must explain itself before you allow yourself to rest. It means holding on to the demand that every emotional wound must make perfect sense before healing can begin. But life is not always neat enough for that. Sometimes the most honest answer is, this happened because that person was unaware. Sometimes the answer is, they were afraid. Sometimes the answer is, they were confused. Sometimes the answer is, they did not know how to love properly. Sometimes the answer is, they were acting from wounds they never understood. And sometimes the answer is simply, I may never fully know. That last answer is the one the ego hates most. Because the ego wants a complete story. It wants a clear villain, a clear reason, a clear lesson, and a clear ending. But spiritual freedom often begins when you stop needing every story to become complete before you reclaim your life. There is a rare peace in letting life remain partly mysterious, not because mystery is comfortable, but because fighting mystery forever is exhausting. Think about how much energy is lost to unanswered questions. Energy that could have gone into rest, into prayer, into growth, into creativity, into friendships, into your body, into your future, into building a life that feels safe again. Instead, the mind keeps spending that energy on a locked door, asking it to open. But some doors stay closed. And sometimes peace begins when you stop bleeding your life into the handle. This does not mean the unanswered question will never return. It may return on quiet nights. It may return when a memory appears unexpectedly. It may return when you see something that reminds you of that person or that season. But returning is not the same as controlling. A thought can visit without becoming your home. That is awareness. You can feel the question rise and not follow it to the end. You can feel the ache and breathe through it. You can let the body soften. You can remind yourself that uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is not unbearable. You can teach your nervous system, slowly and gently, that not knowing is not the same as being unsafe. This is how peace is trained. Not by receiving every answer, but by building the capacity to remain whole without them. And this is where many people misunderstand healing. They think healing means the question disappears forever, but sometimes healing means the question loses its power. It may still exist, but it no longer controls your mood, your choices, your sleep, your worth, or your direction. It becomes a cloud passing through the sky of awareness. The sky does not chase the cloud. The sky does not fight the cloud. The sky allows it to pass. This is the kind of freedom Buddhism points toward. A mind that can witness without clinging. A heart that can feel without drowning, a spirit that can accept incompleteness without turning it into a lifelong punishment. Unanswered questions also hurt because they leave space for self-blame. When someone refuses to explain, the mind often fills the silence with personal accusations. Maybe I was not enough. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I was too much. Maybe I should have acted differently. Maybe I caused it. Maybe I deserved the silence. This is one of the cruelest things about uncertainty. When truth is absent, fear often writes the story, and fear is rarely fair. Fear will make you responsible for someone else's inability to communicate. Fear will make you carry guilt for another person's avoidance. Fear will make you believe their silence is proof of your weakness, when it may only be proof of their emotional limitation. This is why you must be careful about the meaning you create in the absence of answers. Not every silence is a judgment against you. Not every disappearance is a statement about your worth. Not every unanswered question means you failed. Not every unclear ending means you were unlovable. Sometimes silence only proves that silence was all they had to offer. And once you understand this, you stop giving their silence the authority to define you. The mind may still ask, but why did they not care enough to explain? And the deeper answer may be, because care without maturity is often unstable. Someone can feel something and still lack the courage to act with honesty. Someone can value you and still be too emotionally undeveloped to treat you with respect. Someone can know they hurt you and still avoid the conversation because shame feels bigger than responsibility. Human beings are not always consistent. This is painful, but it is also freeing once accepted, because it stops you from searching for perfect logic inside imperfect people. Buddhist wisdom invites you to stop demanding that confused people behave with perfect clarity. It invites you to stop expecting the unconscious to act with full awareness. It invites you to stop waiting for emotionally messy situations to explain themselves neatly before you allow your own heart to breathe. This is not lowering your standards. It is seeing reality clearly. And seeing reality clearly is one of the deepest forms of peace. There is a moment when the heart must say, even without the answer, I know enough to choose peace. You may not know every reason, but you know how it made you feel. You know what it cost you. You know what it taught you. You know what you cannot keep doing to yourself. You know that replaying the same question is no longer saving you. That is enough to begin. Many people delay healing because they think they need all the facts first. But often you do not need all the facts to stop abandoning yourself. You do not need every explanation to stop returning to what hurts you. You do not need a complete confession to recognize emotional harm. You do not need a perfect answer to choose gentleness toward yourself. The heart can begin healing with partial information. It can begin with honesty about your own experience. It can begin with the simple truth that something hurt. It can begin with the decision not to keep turning pain into mental punishment. It can begin with one breath, one moment, one act of release. That is how inner freedom grows. Slowly, the unanswered question becomes less like a wound and more like a teacher. It teaches you how attached the mind is to certainty. It teaches you where you still seek permission to trust yourself. It teaches you how deeply you want life to be fair. It teaches you how much pain comes from demanding that reality become different before you accept it. And if you listen carefully, it teaches you surrender. Surrender does not mean giving up on yourself. It means giving up the war against what cannot be changed. It means no longer using your mind as a battlefield against the past. It means releasing the demand that someone else's silence must be solved before your soul can rest. This kind of surrender is not passive. It is brave, because it takes courage to live without every answer. It takes courage to stop chasing certainty. It takes courage to admit, I do not know, without turning that not knowing into shame, obsession, or self-punishment. And over time, courage becomes peace. You begin to understand that unanswered questions are part of being human. Everyone carries some. Why did that person change? Why did that opportunity disappear? Why did that friendship fade? Why did that loved one never say what needed to be said? Why did life move the way it moved? Not every question becomes a sentence with a clear ending. Some questions become spaces where wisdom grows, but wisdom only grows there when the mind stops fighting the space. If you keep filling the silence with fear, the silence becomes suffering. If you fill it with awareness, it becomes a place of awakening. The same unanswered question can either become a prison or a doorway, depending on how you relate to it. This is why Buddhism keeps bringing you back to the present moment. The unanswered question lives in the mind's relationship with the past. Peace lives in the body's return to now. When you breathe and notice the present, you are teaching yourself that life is still here. You are not trapped inside the old story. You are here, breathing, listening, feeling, growing. The past left a question. The present offers a breath. And the breath is where freedom begins. Not because breathing solves everything, but because it brings you back from the mental world of endless searching. It reminds you that you are alive beyond the wound. You are more than the mystery. You are more than the silence. You are more than the answer you never received. At some point, the deepest closure may sound like this. I wanted an answer, but I will not lose myself because I did not get one. That sentence carries strength. That sentence carries dignity. That sentence carries freedom. Because now your peace is no longer begging at the door of uncertainty. Your heart is no longer waiting for life to become perfectly explained before it softens. Your mind is no longer using unanswered questions as proof that healing must be delayed. You begin to see that peace is not the reward for knowing everything. Peace is the fruit of no longer needing everything to be known. And when that truth lands deeply, the unanswered question may still remain, but it no longer owns you. And slowly, after sitting beside unanswered questions long enough, another layer of suffering begins to reveal itself. The pain is no longer only about missing answers. It is also about the shock of how suddenly everything ended. One day the connection felt alive, familiar, meaningful. Then suddenly something changed. The warmth disappeared. The messages slowed. The emotional distance grew. Or worse, the person vanished completely, leaving the heart standing alone in emotional silence. And the mind keeps asking the same painful question. How can something feel real one moment and disappear the next? There is a special kind of pain that comes from rejection without closure because the nervous system struggles deeply with sudden emotional endings. The heart can survive many difficult truths, but abrupt disconnection creates confusion that the mind does not know how to organize peacefully. Something inside keeps searching for hidden meaning because the ending feels emotionally incomplete. And this is where many people unknowingly become trapped for years. Rejection feels incomplete without closure because human beings naturally seek emotional continuity. The brain wants events to make sense in a clear sequence. It wants a beginning, a middle, and an ending that emotionally connects together. But abandonment often interrupts that sequence violently. It creates an emotional gap where understanding should have existed. And the mind hates gaps, so it begins searching. It searches memories, it searches conversations, it searches facial expressions, it searches old messages, it searches for hidden signs it may have missed, because the brain believes that somewhere inside the past lies the missing piece that will finally make the pain feel understandable. This process happens almost automatically after sudden rejection. The nervous system enters a state of emotional hypervigilance. It replays events repeatedly because it is trying to protect itself from future pain. The mind believes that if it can fully understand why the rejection happened, it will regain control. But this search often becomes endless because emotional endings are rarely as simple as the mind wants them to be. One of the most painful parts of abandonment is that it creates emotional contradiction. The mind remembers the moments of closeness, affection, laughter, vulnerability, promises, and connection. Then it compares those memories against the coldness, silence, distance, or disappearance that followed, and internally the brain struggles to hold both realities together. How could someone who cared suddenly stop caring? How could someone who seemed genuine suddenly become distant? How could something that felt real end so abruptly? These contradictions create emotional shock because the nervous system depends heavily on predictability. Human beings feel emotionally safe when behavior feels consistent. Sudden rejection destroys that sense of emotional stability. This is why abandonment can feel physically painful. The body reacts as if safety itself has been threatened. Sleep changes, appetite changes, breathing changes, concentration disappears. The nervous system becomes restless because emotional connection is deeply tied to survival instincts inside the human brain. Buddhist teachings recognize that attachment creates fear, partly because attachment creates dependency on stability outside ourselves. When someone emotionally important suddenly withdraws, the mind reacts as if part of reality itself has collapsed, and the search for meaning begins immediately afterward. Many people become obsessed with finding the exact moment everything changed. They replay timelines repeatedly, trying to locate the emotional turning point. They ask themselves, was it something I said? Did I become too emotional? Did they lose feelings slowly? Were they pretending the entire time? Was there someone else? The mind keeps digging because uncertainty feels unbearable. But often the deeper suffering is not rejection itself. The deeper suffering comes from resistance to the reality that some endings happen without emotional completion. The ego especially struggles with sudden rejection because rejection wounds identity deeply. The ego naturally wants to feel chosen, valued, important, and emotionally secure. So when someone leaves abruptly or withdraws emotionally without explanation, the ego immediately begins searching for reasons to restore emotional certainty. Sometimes this search becomes self-destructive. A person may spend years blaming themselves for another person's emotional inconsistency. They may develop endless theories about what they lacked. They may compare themselves to others constantly. They may replay tiny mistakes repeatedly while ignoring the larger truth that emotionally unstable people often create unstable endings. This is one of the cruelest effects of rejection without closure. It quietly damages self-trust. The person begins doubting their own perception. Was the connection even real? Did I imagine everything? How could I not see this coming? This self-doubt creates enormous emotional exhaustion because now the mind is not only grieving the loss, it is also questioning its own ability to understand reality. And this is why the brain keeps searching obsessively for hidden meaning after abandonment. The search is not only about the other person anymore, it is also about rebuilding internal stability. The mind wants reassurance that reality still makes sense. But Buddhism teaches something profoundly difficult, yet liberating. Life is not always emotionally linear. Human beings are deeply inconsistent because most people are not fully conscious of themselves. Emotions change, fear interferes, trauma shapes behavior, attachment creates confusion, ego creates avoidance, and people often act from unconscious emotional patterns they barely understand themselves. This means that some endings genuinely do not contain the clarity the wounded person desperately seeks. Not because the pain was meaningless, not because the relationship was fake, but because human beings themselves are often fragmented internally. Confused people create confusing endings. This truth hurts because the heart wants clean emotional conclusions. It wants a final conversation where everything suddenly becomes understandable. But emotionally unavailable people rarely provide emotionally complete endings because they themselves lack emotional clarity internally. Some people withdraw because intimacy scares them. Some disappear because conflict overwhelms them. Some detach because vulnerability activates old wounds. Some avoid difficult conversations because shame feels unbearable. Some leave abruptly because they never learned how to handle emotional responsibility maturely. And the abandoned person suffers because the brain keeps searching for a stable explanation inside unstable behavior. There is another painful layer to rejection without closure. Sudden endings often activate old emotional wounds from earlier life experiences. The nervous system does not only react to the present rejection, it also reacts to previous feelings of abandonment, invisibility, emotional neglect, or inconsistency. This is why certain rejections feel overwhelmingly intense compared to others. The pain becomes larger than the current moment because the nervous system connects it to older emotional memories unconsciously. A person abandoned suddenly in adulthood may unknowingly relive childhood feelings of not feeling emotionally safe, wanted, or consistently loved. And because these wounds feel ancient internally, the mind becomes desperate to solve them. This desperation often disguises itself as obsession over the other person. But underneath the obsession is usually a deeper longing. Please make this pain make sense. Please make me feel emotionally safe again. Please restore certainty. But no external explanation can fully heal wounds that exist deeper inside the nervous system itself. This is why closure alone rarely creates lasting peace. Even when explanations finally arrive, the emotional shock often remains because the deeper wound is not intellectual confusion. The deeper wound is emotional insecurity activated by sudden loss. The ego says, if I can understand the rejection fully, I will feel whole again. But healing does not come only through explanation. Healing comes when the nervous system slowly learns that rejection does not destroy your worth. That process takes time, awareness, gentleness, and emotional presence. One hidden reason rejection feels incomplete is because the mind interprets abandonment personally. The ego immediately turns rejection into identity. They left because I was not enough. They disappeared because I lacked value. They chose distance because something is wrong with me. But human behavior is far more complicated than these conclusions. A person's inability to sustain connection often reflects their own emotional capacity more than your worthiness. Someone can genuinely care about you and still lack the emotional stability to maintain intimacy. Someone can feel overwhelmed by closeness and withdraw despite real feelings existing. Someone can value connection and still sabotage it because unresolved fear controls them unconsciously. But the wounded mind struggles to accept these complexities because simple self-blame feels emotionally easier than uncertainty. At least self-blame creates a clear explanation. The mind says, if it was my fault, then reality still makes sense. If I caused this, then I can prevent it next time. If I was the problem, then there is still order. This is why people often cling to self-criticism after rejection. It gives the illusion of control. But self-blame rarely creates healing. It usually creates shame. And shame deepens attachment to rejection because now the pain becomes connected to identity itself. Buddhist teachings constantly encourage awareness because awareness interrupts unconscious identification. You begin noticing that thoughts about rejection are not absolute truth. The mind says, "I was abandoned because I am unlovable," but awareness sees this as pain speaking, not reality. This distinction matters deeply. Without awareness, rejection easily becomes a lifelong emotional identity. Some people unconsciously build their entire self-concept around abandonment. They carry invisible beliefs for years. People always leave. I am difficult to love. Connection is never safe. Everyone eventually disappears. These beliefs shape future relationships, future fears, future decisions, and future suffering. And all of it begins from the brain trying to create meaning after incomplete emotional endings. This is why inner healing requires more than analyzing rejection intellectually. It requires rebuilding emotional safety internally. The nervous system must slowly learn that another person's departure does not equal personal destruction. That lesson changes everything, because eventually the heart begins realizing, yes, the rejection hurt deeply. Yes, the ending felt incomplete. Yes, there are still unanswered questions. But none of those realities define your value permanently. This understanding weakens obsessive searching gradually. The mind no longer needs to replay every memory, endlessly trying to solve the rejection, because awareness begins accepting a deeper truth. Human beings are imperfect, inconsistent, emotionally wounded, and often unconscious. Sudden endings frequently reveal another person's inner instability more than objective truth about your worth. This realization softens emotional self-attack. Another painful aspect of incomplete rejection is that the nervous system often remains emotionally frozen in anticipation. Part of the mind secretly waits for reversal, a message, a return, an explanation, a reconnection. Emotional closure feels incomplete because internally the attachment still remains active. This creates emotional suspension. Life continues externally, while internally the mind remains standing beside the abandoned relationship, emotionally waiting for continuation. This waiting drains enormous emotional energy because attention remains tied to what disappeared instead of what still exists now. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when awareness becomes trapped in attachment to what no longer exists. The mind resists endings constantly. It says, "This cannot be over. There must be more. This story cannot end like this." But reality continues moving. One of the hardest spiritual practices is allowing endings to truly end emotionally instead of continuously reopening them mentally. This does not mean forgetting. It means no longer feeding the emotional loop constantly, because every replay strengthens attachment slightly. Every obsessive interpretation deepens emotional entanglement. Every desperate search for hidden meaning delays acceptance. And slowly, the nervous system becomes exhausted. There comes a point during healing when the heart grows tired of searching, tired of decoding, tired of analyzing emotional fragments endlessly, tired of trying to force certainty from confusion. This exhaustion can become sacred, because exhaustion sometimes creates surrender, not hopeless surrender, peaceful surrender. The kind that finally says, "I may never fully understand why this ended the way it did. I may never receive the clarity I wanted. I may never know the full truth inside their mind. But I cannot keep sacrificing my entire inner life searching endlessly for answers." That realization marks the beginning of emotional freedom. For the first time, attention slowly begins returning to the present moment instead of remaining trapped inside emotional investigation. The nervous system begins learning that uncertainty can exist without constant emergency. The body slowly relaxes, breathing softens, thoughts still come, but they lose some intensity. The rejection no longer feels like a puzzle that must be solved before life can continue. This is where Buddhist wisdom becomes deeply healing. Buddhism does not promise perfect emotional certainty. It teaches something more powerful. It teaches how to remain present even while uncertainty exists. That skill changes suffering completely, because eventually you realize the deepest pain was not only rejection itself. The deepest pain was the endless war against reality afterward, the refusal to allow the ending to remain incomplete peacefully. And once that resistance softens, healing begins quietly. Not because every answer arrived, not because the rejection suddenly felt fair, not because the abandonment became acceptable, but because awareness stopped demanding emotional certainty before allowing peace to return. This is when the nervous system slowly learns something life-changing. You can survive incomplete endings. You can survive unanswered questions. You can survive rejection without losing your entire identity. And most importantly, you can stop searching for hidden meaning long enough to finally begin living again. And after enough searching, enough replaying, and enough nights spent trying to force clarity from painful endings, another realization slowly begins to rise from the silence. Sometimes the reason things felt so confusing is because the person themselves was deeply confused. Sometimes the mixed signals, sudden changes, emotional contradictions, and unfinished endings were not carefully planned mysteries. Sometimes they were simply the natural result of someone who never truly understood themselves. And this realization changes the way suffering is carried. There is a strange sadness that comes from realizing some people move through life disconnected from their own inner world. They do not fully understand their emotions, their fears, their wounds, or even their own behavior. One moment they feel close to you, the next moment they feel overwhelmed. One day they crave intimacy, the next day they run from it. One part of them wants connection, while another part fears it deeply. And when people are divided within themselves, the relationships they create often become divided too. This is why confused people frequently create confused endings. The heart suffers deeply when it expects consistency from someone internally unstable. At first, the connection may feel real because parts of it truly are real. The affection may be genuine, the care may be genuine, the bond may be genuine. But when someone lacks self-awareness, their emotions become unpredictable because they themselves do not fully understand what controls them internally. This creates emotional chaos for everyone around them. One of the hardest truths to accept is that some people are strangers to themselves. They have spent years avoiding introspection. They distract themselves constantly. They move through life reacting emotionally without stopping to examine why they feel what they feel. They chase temporary relief instead of inner understanding. They confuse attention with love, attachment with intimacy, and emotional intensity with emotional depth. And because they do not understand themselves clearly, they cannot offer stable clarity to others. This is where many people become trapped after painful endings. They keep searching for a perfectly organized explanation from someone whose inner world was never organized to begin with. The mind keeps asking, how could they change so suddenly? How could they say one thing and do another? How could they seem so genuine and then disappear emotionally? But clarity cannot come from inner chaos. A person who is disconnected from themselves often behaves in ways that even they cannot fully explain honestly. Their decisions shift with emotion. Their feelings change rapidly because they are driven more by unconscious fear than conscious awareness. They may genuinely believe something in one moment and completely contradict themselves later because they have no stable inner foundation. And unfortunately, emotionally conscious people often struggle to understand this because they assume everyone relates to emotions with the same level of reflection they do. But many people never pause long enough to examine their own patterns deeply. Buddhist teachings often emphasize awareness because unconsciousness creates suffering not only internally but relationally. A person unaware of their own fears, attachments, insecurities and wounds will unconsciously spread confusion into every relationship they touch. Someone afraid of abandonment may suddenly withdraw first. Someone terrified of vulnerability may sabotage intimacy once it becomes real. Someone carrying shame may avoid honesty because truth threatens their identity. Someone emotionally fragmented may crave love deeply while simultaneously fearing it. And because these conflicts remain unconscious inside them, their relationships become unstable reflections of that inner conflict. This is why some people feel emotionally safe one week and emotionally distant the next. Their behavior changes because their inner world is constantly shifting beneath the surface. They are reacting emotionally instead of responding consciously, and the people who love them suffer because they keep expecting stable emotional logic from someone internally divided. There is hidden freedom in finally understanding this, not because it excuses harmful behavior, not because the pain suddenly disappears, but because you stop personalizing every confusing action as proof of your own inadequacy. This changes the entire emotional experience. You begin seeing that some people create chaos simply because chaos exists inside them already. Their mixed signals often reflect internal confusion more than deliberate cruelty. Their inconsistency reflects emotional instability more than your lack of worth. Their inability to communicate clearly reflects their own disconnection from themselves, and once this becomes visible, self-blame begins softening. Many people unknowingly spend years trying to solve emotionally unavailable individuals like emotional puzzles. They search for the real meaning behind inconsistent behavior. They believe that somewhere underneath the confusion lies a stable version of the person they briefly experienced during moments of closeness. But sometimes the inconsistency itself is the truth. This realization hurts deeply because the heart naturally wants to preserve the beautiful moments. It wants to believe the loving version of the person was the real version. But human beings are rarely that simple. Confused people often contain many contradictory emotional states at once. One part of them may genuinely love connection. Another part may fear losing control. One part may crave intimacy. Another part may panic when intimacy becomes emotionally real. One part may want honesty. Another part may fear accountability. And because they never developed enough awareness to integrate these inner conflicts consciously, the relationships around them become emotionally unstable. This is why some endings feel so disorienting. The wounded person keeps trying to identify which version of the person was real, but often all the versions were real in different moments. Human beings can genuinely feel affection while simultaneously carrying fear powerful enough to destroy connection later. This complexity confuses the mind because the mind wants emotional certainty. But Buddhism constantly reminds us that human beings are impermanent, unstable, and deeply shaped by unconscious attachment. People often change according to fear, desire, loneliness, insecurity, ego, or emotional pain without fully realizing it themselves. This is why clarity cannot always emerge from emotionally unconscious people. A person cannot offer deep truth externally while remaining disconnected internally. And this explains why some conversations after painful endings feel strangely empty. The wounded person seeks emotional depth, accountability, and honest self-reflection. But the other person responds vaguely, defensively, emotionally numb, contradictory, or detached. Not necessarily because they enjoy hurting others, but because they genuinely lack the inner awareness required for the conversation being asked of them. Some people simply do not possess emotional depth equal to the pain they create. This realization feels heartbreaking at first because it removes fantasy. The fantasy says, if we talk one more time, everything will finally make sense. If they become honest, clarity will appear. If I ask the right question, I will finally understand. But emotionally unconscious people rarely produce emotionally satisfying explanations because they themselves are internally fragmented. And expecting stable truth from emotional instability creates endless suffering. There is another painful reason confused people create confused endings. Often they are trying to escape themselves through relationships. They seek comfort, validation, distraction, emotional excitement, or temporary relief from inner emptiness. But because they never address the deeper emotional void inside themselves, the relationship eventually becomes overwhelmed by the unresolved pain they carried into it. This is why some people suddenly lose emotional consistency once the excitement fades. During the beginning stages of connection, distraction temporarily covers inner instability. But eventually, unresolved wounds return, fear returns, restlessness returns, emotional confusion returns. And because they never learned how to face themselves honestly, they unconsciously project the chaos outward. Relationships become unstable because internally they remain unstable. This is one reason Buddhism places so much emphasis on self-awareness before attachment. A person disconnected from themselves will often seek emotional rescue through others, but no relationship can permanently stabilize someone unwilling to understand their own mind. This creates enormous suffering because emotionally conscious people often believe love alone can heal confusion. They think patience, empathy, understanding, or loyalty will eventually help the other person become emotionally stable. But awareness cannot be forced onto someone from the outside. A person must willingly confront themselves. And many spend years avoiding this confrontation because self-awareness is painful. Looking inward honestly means facing fear, shame, contradiction, insecurity, selfishness, emotional wounds, and unresolved grief. Many people would rather remain distracted than sit quietly with those realities. So instead of healing internally, they move endlessly between relationships, distractions, emotional escapes, and temporary highs. And every unresolved inner conflict eventually appears inside their relationships again. This creates a tragic cycle where confused people continue creating confused endings repeatedly without fully understanding why their life patterns never change. Meanwhile, the people they hurt remain emotionally trapped, trying to force clarity from chaos. But clarity cannot come from chaos. This sentence becomes deeply liberating once fully understood. Because suddenly the wounded person stops demanding complete emotional coherence from someone who never possessed it internally. They stop expecting emotionally fragmented individuals to produce perfectly stable explanations. And slowly, the obsession with solving the person weakens. This does not mean the pain disappears immediately. Grief still exists. Disappointment still exists. Loneliness still exists. But self-torture begins decreasing because the mind no longer keeps insisting. There must be a perfect explanation hidden somewhere. Sometimes the explanation is simply that the person lacked inner stability. This is difficult for empathetic people to accept because empathy naturally searches for deeper meaning. But not every painful situation contains profound, hidden complexity. Sometimes emotional inconsistency is exactly what it appeared to be: emotional inconsistency. One reason people resist accepting this is because uncertainty feels emotionally unsatisfying. The ego wants neat conclusions. It wants emotionally intelligent explanations that restore order to the pain. But emotionally unconscious people rarely provide emotionally orderly endings. Their endings reflect their inner fragmentation. A person disconnected from themselves often leaves others emotionally disoriented because their actions lack stable alignment. Their words and behavior conflict. Their emotions shift unpredictably. Their communication becomes inconsistent because internally they themselves are inconsistent. And the more someone tries to force complete clarity from this instability, the more emotionally exhausted they become. Buddhist wisdom gently encourages a different path. Instead of endlessly analyzing another person's inner chaos, awareness begins returning inward. The focus shifts from, "How do I finally understand them completely?" to, "How do I stop losing myself inside confusion?" This shift marks the beginning of freedom, because true peace does not require decoding every emotionally unavailable person perfectly. True peace begins when you stop sacrificing your mental stability trying to organize another person's internal disorder. This understanding creates enormous emotional relief. You stop expecting emotionally confused people to suddenly behave with deep consistency. You stop expecting wounded people to magically develop self-awareness during painful endings. You stop demanding complete logic from unconscious emotional behavior. And most importantly, you stop interpreting every confusing ending as proof of personal failure. Sometimes the ending was confusing because the person themselves was confused. That realization changes how rejection feels internally. The mind no longer needs to obsessively search for hidden mistakes inside yourself because the focus shifts toward seeing reality clearly. Human beings are often emotionally unstable, deeply wounded, disconnected from themselves, and driven by unconscious fear. This does not make their behavior acceptable, but it does make it understandable without self-destruction. There is hidden compassion inside this realization too, not naive compassion that tolerates mistreatment endlessly, but mature compassion that sees human confusion honestly. Many people are suffering internally far more than they appear externally. Their avoidance, inconsistency, dishonesty, emotional distance, and instability often reflect unresolved battles inside themselves. And people who are lost internally often create loss externally too. This understanding softens resentment gradually because resentment often depends on believing the other person acted with complete awareness. But many harmful behaviors come from unconsciousness, not deep intentional malice. Again, this does not excuse harm, but it changes the emotional burden you carry. Because anger begins transforming into clarity. You realize they could not offer stable clarity because they did not possess stable clarity internally. They could not communicate emotional truth clearly because they were disconnected from themselves. They could not provide peace because they themselves lacked peace. And strangely, this realization allows the nervous system to relax slightly. The emotional struggle against confusion begins fading because the confusion itself finally makes sense. One of the deepest forms of inner freedom is accepting that some people may never fully understand themselves during this lifetime. They may continue repeating patterns unconsciously. They may continue running from introspection. They may continue creating unstable relationships because they never learned how to sit honestly with their own inner world. And your healing cannot wait for their awakening. This becomes one of the most important lessons of emotional maturity. You stop delaying your peace until another person becomes emotionally conscious. You stop requiring emotional stability from unstable minds. You stop chasing clarity through emotionally chaotic people. Instead, awareness returns home, back to your breath, back to your body, back to your present life, back to your own inner truth. And slowly, something beautiful happens. The confusion no longer controls your emotional world completely. Not because every answer arrived, not because the ending suddenly became fair, but because you finally stopped asking chaos to become clarity before allowing yourself to heal. That is the hidden freedom, the freedom of understanding that some people never truly knew themselves deeply enough to offer the kind of emotional clarity your heart kept searching for. And once you fully accept that, the desperate search for meaning finally begins to quiet. And once the mind finally begins to understand that clarity cannot come from inner chaos, another painful pattern slowly becomes visible. The suffering is no longer only coming from what happened in the past. It is also coming from the constant return to it, the endless revisiting, the repeated replaying, the quiet habit of reopening emotional wounds while secretly hoping this time they will finally heal. But wounds do not heal by being touched endlessly. There is a silent form of suffering that many people mistake for healing. It happens late at night when old conversations are replayed again. It happens while rereading messages that should have been left alone. It happens while checking old photos, revisiting old memories, imagining different outcomes, or mentally returning to painful moments again and again. The mind says, "I am trying to understand," but often the heart is simply bleeding repeatedly from the same place. This is one of the deepest traps in the search for closure. The person believes they are moving toward peace while unconsciously feeding the pain every single day. Each replay reactivates the emotional wound. Each return to the memory strengthens the emotional attachment slightly. Each mental revisit reminds the nervous system of the original hurt, and slowly, suffering becomes a cycle the mind itself keeps alive. At first, revisiting the pain feels natural. The brain is trying to process emotional shock. Human beings naturally return mentally to painful experiences after betrayal, abandonment, rejection, or loss. The nervous system wants to make sense of what happened. It wants to reduce uncertainty. It wants emotional safety restored. But there is a difference between processing pain and living inside it. Many people cross that line without realizing it. They begin building daily emotional rituals around the wound. They wake up and immediately think about the person. They replay old arguments while showering. They reread conversations before sleeping. They imagine future explanations that will probably never happen. They revisit social media pages searching for hidden meaning in tiny details. And all of this keeps the nervous system emotionally connected to the injury. Buddhist teachings often compare attachment to repeatedly picking at a wound that is trying to close. Every time awareness returns obsessively to the same pain, the healing process becomes interrupted. The mind believes it is solving something, but emotionally it is reopening the cut again and again. This is why some people remain emotionally trapped for years after an ending. Not because the original wound was impossible to survive, but because the wound never stopped being reopened internally. The mind becomes addicted to emotional replay, and like many addictions, it disguises itself as something necessary. The person tells themselves, "I just need to think about it one more time. I just need to understand one more detail. I just need to figure out why they did that." But the emotional replay never truly ends because the mind is no longer searching for answers. It is trapped inside emotional habit. This is one reason suffering becomes so exhausting after heartbreak or abandonment. The pain is no longer only coming from the original experience. It is coming from the continuous mental resurrection of the experience afterward. The body reacts to remembered pain similarly to present pain. When someone mentally revisits betrayal repeatedly, the nervous system activates again. Stress hormones rise, muscles tighten, breathing changes, emotional distress returns. The body responds as if the wound is happening again right now. This is why memories can feel physically painful. The nervous system does not fully distinguish between actual danger and vividly remembered emotional danger. So every replay strengthens the emotional pathways connected to suffering, and this creates a cruel cycle. The pain creates obsessive thinking. Obsessive thinking reactivates the pain. The reactivated pain creates more obsessive thinking, and slowly the mind becomes trapped inside emotional looping. One of the hardest truths to accept is that constantly revisiting old pain rarely produces new wisdom after a certain point. At first, reflection can absolutely help healing. Honest self-awareness matters. Learning from experiences matters. Understanding unhealthy patterns matters. But eventually reflection stops being reflection. It becomes rumination, and rumination quietly destroys peace. Rumination is different because it does not move forward. It circles endlessly. The same memories, the same emotions, the same questions, the same fantasies, the same regrets, the same imagined conversations. Nothing new is truly being discovered anymore. The mind is simply feeding suffering through repetition. This is why Buddhist wisdom places such importance on awareness. Awareness interrupts unconscious emotional loops. It notices when thought has stopped serving healing and started serving attachment instead. Without awareness, people can spend enormous portions of their life mentally reliving pain. Years pass while internally they remain emotionally frozen beside old memories. The tragedy is that many people believe this constant replay proves the relationship or pain mattered deeply. They fear that letting go means minimizing what happened, so they keep returning to the wound because emotionally it feels connected to loyalty, love, or truth. But releasing attachment does not erase meaning. You can honor what hurt you without living inside it forever. This distinction changes everything. Many people secretly believe pain must be continuously revisited to avoid forgetting the emotional significance of what happened. But this belief keeps the nervous system trapped in survival mode. The heart never fully rests because the mind continuously signals danger through memory, and eventually emotional exhaustion appears. Not dramatic exhaustion, quiet exhaustion, the kind where the soul feels tired all the time. Tired of thinking, tired of replaying, tired of remembering, tired of mentally standing beside the same wound every day. This exhaustion becomes especially painful because the person often feels powerless to stop. Thoughts appear automatically. Memories arise suddenly. Emotional triggers seem everywhere. Songs, places, smells, dates, certain words, tiny reminders. And every trigger pulls awareness back into the emotional wound again. Buddhist teachings never promise that painful memories will disappear completely. Instead, they teach something more realistic and more compassionate. They teach how to change your relationship with the memory itself. This is deeply important, because suffering increases when memories are constantly resisted, chased, fed, or emotionally worshipped. Awareness allows memories to exist without automatically entering the emotional storm attached to them. At first, this feels almost impossible. The mind is used to following every painful memory immediately. A memory appears, and instantly the analysis begins. The replay begins. The emotional reliving begins. But awareness creates a small space between memory and reaction. Inside that space, freedom slowly grows. A painful memory may appear, but awareness notices. I do not have to reopen the wound completely right now. I do not have to follow this thought endlessly. I do not have to mentally relive every detail again. This does not mean suppressing emotion. Suppression creates different suffering. It means learning how to witness memories without drowning inside them repeatedly. That skill becomes life-changing, because eventually the person realizes the mind itself has been participating in prolonging suffering. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply through unconscious habit. The brain becomes attached to familiar emotional loops even when they hurt. Human beings often return to familiar pain because familiar pain feels psychologically safer than uncertain freedom. This sounds strange at first, but it is deeply true. Some people continue replaying painful memories because the memories became emotionally connected to identity. The suffering became familiar. The heartbreak became part of how they understand themselves. The betrayal became part of their emotional story. And without the story, the ego feels uncertain. Who am I without this pain? Who am I if I stop replaying this memory? Who am I if I truly let this go? These hidden fears keep attachment alive. This is why healing can feel strangely uncomfortable. Letting go of repetitive suffering means stepping into unfamiliar emotional space. The ego often resists this because identity built around pain feels emotionally stable, even when painful. Buddhist wisdom gently points toward non-attachment because attachment turns temporary pain into long-term suffering. The original wound may have lasted weeks or months, but attachment to replaying the wound can last decades, and this attachment quietly steals the present moment. Many people physically leave painful relationships while mentally remaining inside them for years afterward. Their body moves forward, but their awareness stays trapped in the past. Every quiet moment becomes filled with emotional replay. Life continues passing while the mind remains emotionally anchored to old pain. This creates enormous grief once fully recognized. A person suddenly realizes how many beautiful moments were missed because attention stayed locked inside suffering. Relationships, opportunities, peaceful mornings, joy, rest, creativity, presence, all partially overshadowed by continuous mental revisiting of the wound. This realization hurts, but it also awakens something powerful, because eventually the heart asks, how much longer do I want to live this way? That question becomes the beginning of liberation. Not because the memories disappear instantly, not because the pain magically dissolves overnight, but because awareness finally notices the cost of constantly reopening the wound. This is when healing becomes intentional. Instead of automatically feeding painful memories, the person slowly begins protecting their inner peace more carefully. They stop revisiting conversations compulsively. They stop checking for hidden meaning constantly. They stop feeding emotional fantasies about different endings. And gradually, the nervous system begins calming. This process requires patience because emotional habits formed over months or years do not disappear immediately. The mind will still return to old memories sometimes. Certain triggers will still activate emotion. Some nights will still feel heavy. But awareness changes the relationship with those moments. Instead of fully entering the emotional storm again, awareness begins saying, yes, this memory hurts, but I do not need to reopen the wound entirely. Yes, this mattered deeply, but I do not need to relive it endlessly to prove that. This gentleness matters deeply. Many people attack themselves for still thinking about the past, but self-judgment creates more suffering. The goal is not perfect emotional control. The goal is conscious awareness of what nourishes peace versus what strengthens pain. And over time, awareness notices something important. Repeatedly revisiting suffering does not honor the wound. It often imprisons the wounded person inside it. True healing begins when memories stop controlling the nervous system completely. The past becomes something remembered, not something continuously relived. This shift creates enormous emotional space. Breathing becomes easier. Silence becomes less threatening. The mind becomes quieter. The body relaxes more naturally, not because the past changed, but because awareness stopped feeding the emotional fire constantly. One reason people chase closure through memories is because they secretly hope a different emotional outcome will appear mentally. The mind imagines alternate conversations, alternate choices, alternate endings. If only I said this. If only they understood. If only I noticed sooner. If only things ended differently. But these imagined alternate realities keep the nervous system emotionally attached to a version of life that no longer exists. And attachment to imagined realities creates suffering too. Buddhism teaches that reality itself must eventually be accepted fully before peace becomes possible, not approved of, not liked, not celebrated, but accepted as real. The relationship ended the way it ended. The person behaved the way they behaved. The wound happened. The confusion happened. The silence happened. And no amount of mental replay changes that reality now. This realization feels painful at first because the ego desperately wants the past to become emotionally editable. But once the mind stops trying to rewrite reality internally, enormous energy becomes available again for actual living. That energy returns slowly. A person begins noticing small moments again. Morning light, conversations, music, rest, nature, breathing, stillness. The present moment becomes visible again because awareness is no longer trapped entirely inside emotional resurrection of the past. This is where true closure quietly begins, not through one final conversation, not through perfect understanding, not through endless analysis, but through no longer needing to reopen the wound every day to feel connected to what happened. That is freedom. The memory may still exist. The sadness may still appear sometimes. The loss may still matter deeply, but the emotional wound no longer gets torn open repeatedly by unconscious attachment. And slowly, the heart begins trusting itself enough to stop living inside yesterday's pain. That trust changes everything, because eventually awareness realizes, I suffered enough already. I do not need to continue recreating the suffering internally. I can remember without reliving. I can honor the experience without remaining trapped inside it. And this realization becomes one of the deepest forms of healing. Not forgetting, not denying, not suppressing, simply no longer reopening the wound every time the mind asks you to bleed again. And little by little, after the mind stops reopening the same wounds every day, a deeper kind of wisdom begins to emerge. Not every pain can be solved. Not every ending can be explained. Not every betrayal will make sense. Some stories will always carry missing pieces. Some people will leave without accountability. Some questions will remain unanswered forever. And strangely, true peace often begins the moment you stop demanding completeness from life. There is a quiet maturity that develops when a person finally realizes reality is not always emotionally satisfying. The heart naturally wants fairness. It wants honesty. It wants understanding. It wants every painful experience to eventually transform into a meaningful lesson wrapped neatly in clarity and closure. But life does not always offer that. Sometimes people lie and never admit it. Sometimes people disappear and never explain why. Sometimes relationships collapse without one final conversation. Sometimes kindness is not returned. Sometimes love is not protected. Sometimes injustice remains unanswered. And the mind suffers deeply because it keeps resisting this incompleteness. This resistance is one of the hidden roots of emotional pain. Human beings often believe peace will arrive after reality finally becomes emotionally organized. The mind says, when I fully understand, I will heal. When justice happens, I will move on. When they finally admit the truth, I will feel free. But emotional maturity begins when you realize peace cannot wait forever for life to become perfectly resolved. This realization changes the entire relationship with suffering, because suddenly the goal is no longer forcing every story into emotional completion. The goal becomes learning how to live peacefully, even when some parts of life remain unfinished. That is rare wisdom. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy fighting reality internally. They argue mentally with what already happened. They replay different outcomes. They imagine alternate endings. They wait for apologies, justice, explanations, or recognition that may never come. And all of this creates invisible exhaustion. The nervous system becomes tired from constantly carrying emotional resistance. A person may appear functional externally while internally fighting the same unresolved battle every day. But reality does not become softer simply because the mind refuses to accept it. This is one of the deepest Buddhist truths. Suffering increases whenever the mind demands that reality become different before allowing peace to exist. The pain itself may be unavoidable for a time, but resistance multiplies it endlessly. This is why emotionally incomplete situations can become lifelong prisons for some people. The event ends, but the mental resistance continues for years afterward. The mind keeps saying, "This should not have happened. They should have known better. I deserved clarity. This story cannot end like this." And maybe all of that is true, but reality already moved forward. This is what makes acceptance so difficult. Acceptance feels unfair at first because people confuse acceptance with approval. They think accepting reality means saying the pain was justified or deserved, but acceptance simply means seeing clearly what already exists without continuously fighting it internally. The relationship ended. The apology never came. The betrayal happened. The silence remained. The story stayed incomplete. Acceptance does not erase grief. It ends the war against reality. That difference matters deeply. One hidden reason people struggle with incomplete endings is because the ego wants emotional symmetry. The ego wants good actions rewarded and harmful actions punished. It wants honesty to matter consistently. It wants emotional investments to make logical sense. It wants life to behave according to fairness. But reality often refuses these expectations. Some deeply loving people are abandoned. Some dishonest people avoid consequences for years. Some emotionally immature people continue living without self-awareness. Some cruel actions never receive proper accountability. And the heart struggles because it cannot emotionally organize this unfairness easily. This is why emotional maturity is so rare. It requires the ability to remain compassionate, open, and internally stable, even while recognizing that life will not always provide satisfying conclusions. Many people never reach this point because they keep waiting for external resolution before developing internal peace. They postpone their healing while expecting reality to eventually correct itself emotionally. But inner freedom begins when healing no longer depends entirely on external correction. This is not easy. There is grief involved in accepting incomplete reality. A deep grief. Not only grief for what happened, but grief for what never happened. The conversation that never came, the understanding that never arrived, the emotional honesty that never appeared. People often underestimate how painful it is to mourn unrealized possibilities. Sometimes the hardest thing to release is not the relationship itself. It is the imagined ending you hoped would happen someday. The fantasy that eventually the truth would emerge clearly, that eventually the other person would understand, that eventually life would organize itself emotionally. But maturity begins when fantasy loosens its grip. Buddhist teachings speak often about impermanence because suffering increases when human beings cling too tightly to how they think life should unfold. Reality constantly changes in incomplete, unpredictable ways. Relationships shift, emotions shift, human beings contradict themselves. Some stories remain unresolved forever, and peace becomes possible only when awareness stops demanding certainty from an uncertain world. This creates enormous emotional freedom, because suddenly the mind no longer needs every experience to become perfectly meaningful before releasing attachment. It no longer requires every emotional wound to transform into a neat life lesson immediately. Some experiences simply hurt. Some endings simply remain messy. Some people simply remain unconscious. And strangely, accepting this reality softens suffering more than endless resistance ever could. One reason incomplete endings feel unbearable is because human beings naturally crave narrative closure. The mind experiences life through stories. Stories with beginnings, explanations, emotional arcs, and conclusions. When something ends abruptly or unfairly, the nervous system struggles because the emotional narrative feels interrupted, so the mind keeps trying to finish the story internally. But sometimes there is no emotionally satisfying ending available. This is where many people become trapped. They refuse to emotionally move forward because part of them still believes the story remains unfinished. They keep waiting for the final chapter that will suddenly transform confusion into clarity. But some stories never receive that chapter, and emotional maturity means learning how to put the book down anyway. This is difficult because the ego interprets incompleteness as emotional danger. It believes unfinished stories threaten identity, safety, and meaning. So it continues searching, replaying, analyzing, hoping. But awareness begins recognizing something deeper. The endless search itself often becomes the greater suffering. There comes a moment during healing when the heart quietly asks, "What if this is all the explanation I will ever receive? What if reality truly remains incomplete? What if I never fully understand?" At first, these questions create fear, but eventually they create release, because for the first time, attention begins shifting away from forcing completion and toward building peace despite incompleteness. This shift changes everything internally. The nervous system slowly relaxes because it no longer lives in constant emotional pursuit. The mind stops chasing resolution obsessively. The body stops carrying endless tension around unfinished emotional stories, and life begins opening again, not because everything was solved, but because the need for everything to be solved softened. This is one of the most powerful forms of emotional freedom. The freedom to let some things remain unanswered without turning the unanswered into lifelong suffering. The ego struggles deeply with this because the ego believes emotional security comes from certainty. But Buddhist wisdom reveals something radically different. True peace comes from developing the capacity to remain grounded even when certainty is unavailable. That is inner strength, not controlling reality, not forcing closure, not guaranteeing fairness, simply remaining present without collapsing emotionally when life stays incomplete. This maturity changes relationships too. A person who accepts incompleteness becomes less desperate for constant reassurance. They stop forcing emotional certainty from others compulsively. They stop expecting human beings to behave perfectly all the time. They stop building emotional stability entirely around external predictability. Instead, stability begins growing internally. This does not make someone cold or detached. It actually makes love healthier because love no longer depends on controlling outcomes constantly. The heart becomes softer, calmer, less fearful of uncertainty, because awareness understands something important now. Life itself is incomplete. Every human being carries unfinished stories, unspoken words, unanswered questions, unresolved grief, unfulfilled hopes, hidden regrets, emotional contradictions. No one escapes this entirely. The difference is that some people spend their whole lives fighting incompleteness, while others eventually learn how to live beside it peacefully. This is why Buddhist practice constantly returns attention to the present moment. The present moment does not require every story to be finished before it can be experienced fully. Breathing happens now. Awareness happens now. Life continues now. But the mind often abandons the present while chasing emotional completion elsewhere. It says, "Once I understand, then I will rest. Once justice comes, then I will heal. Once they finally explain, then I can move on." And meanwhile, life keeps passing. This realization can feel heartbreaking. A person suddenly notices how much emotional energy was sacrificed chasing completion that never arrived. How many peaceful moments were interrupted by mental arguments with reality. How much life was postponed emotionally. But this realization also creates awakening, because eventually the soul becomes tired of fighting incomplete reality constantly, tired of mentally negotiating with the past, tired of demanding emotional symmetry from life, tired of trying to force every wound into understandable order. And in that exhaustion, surrender begins. Not hopeless surrender, peaceful surrender, the kind that finally says, "Yes, this hurts. Yes, this feels unfinished. Yes, I wish things were different. But I will not spend the rest of my life emotionally chained to what never completed itself." That decision changes suffering profoundly. One hidden freedom in allowing reality to remain incomplete is that identity slowly separates from the pain. The person no longer defines themselves entirely through unresolved stories. The unfinished relationship stops becoming the center of their inner world. The unanswered question stops controlling every emotional state. The past still exists, but it no longer dominates consciousness completely. This creates space internally, space for joy again, space for curiosity, space for rest, space for future connection, space for stillness, and most importantly, space for self-compassion. Because once a person accepts that life itself contains incompleteness, naturally, they stop attacking themselves for not being able to solve every painful experience perfectly. This gentleness matters deeply. Many people carry shame about still hurting from unresolved situations. They think they should already have complete peace. But emotional maturity is not the absence of pain. It is the ability to remain open-hearted, even while pain remains partly unresolved. This is rare wisdom, especially in a world obsessed with quick answers, instant closure, and emotionally perfect narratives. Buddhist wisdom offers something more sustainable. It teaches how to remain internally grounded while reality remains uncertain, incomplete, and imperfect. And this grounding becomes stronger over time. At first, incompleteness feels unbearable. Then it feels uncomfortable. Then it feels manageable. Eventually, it simply becomes part of being human. Not every story ends with understanding. Not every wound receives justice. Not every relationship receives proper closure. And still, peace remains possible. This realization changes how the heart experiences reality itself. Instead of demanding perfect completion constantly, awareness becomes more flexible, more compassionate, more patient with uncertainty. The person no longer collapses emotionally every time life refuses to provide satisfying conclusions, because now they understand something deeper. Reality was never required to become emotionally perfect before inner freedom could begin. Inner freedom begins the moment resistance softens enough to let reality exist exactly as it is. This is why acceptance carries such hidden power. Not because acceptance changes the past, but because acceptance ends the endless internal war against what already happened. And once that war quiets, something beautiful slowly returns. Stillness. The kind of stillness that no longer needs every answer before breathing peacefully again. The kind of stillness that allows unfinished stories to exist without becoming emotional prisons. The kind of stillness that understands some things may never fully make sense, and yet life can still be meaningful, gentle, and deeply worth living. That is emotional maturity, not forcing life into perfect understanding, but learning how to remain whole even when parts of life stay incomplete forever. And when a person finally begins to accept that some parts of life may stay incomplete forever, another hidden movement of the mind becomes easier to notice. Even after the story has ended, even after the person is gone, even after the silence has become reality, the mind may still keep talking to them. Not out loud, but inside. In the quiet room of thought, the old conversation continues. This is one of the strangest pains after betrayal. The person may no longer be in your life, but the argument still lives in your head. There is a special kind of exhaustion that comes from mentally speaking to someone who is no longer listening. You may be washing dishes, lying in bed, walking alone, or trying to focus on something ordinary, and suddenly the mind begins again. It creates the perfect sentence, the perfect defense, the perfect accusation, the perfect explanation of how deeply you were hurt. It imagines their face, their response, their guilt, their apology, or their silence. And for a few moments the mind feels powerful because it finally says what it could not say then. But when the imaginary conversation ends, the body still feels heavy. The wound is still there. The past is still unchanged. The other person still has not heard you. And peace still feels far away. This is why imaginary conversations become so painful. They feel like release, but often they become another form of attachment. They give the mind a temporary sense of control while quietly keeping the heart connected to the same wound. After betrayal, the mind creates imaginary conversations because betrayal leaves behind unfinished emotional energy. Something inside feels interrupted. Maybe you were never allowed to explain yourself. Maybe the other person twisted the story. Maybe they left before you could speak. Maybe they denied what happened. Maybe they acted innocent while you carried the damage alone. So the mind tries to complete the emotional moment internally. It builds a courtroom inside your head. You become the witness, the lawyer, the judge, and the wounded person all at once. You present the evidence. You replay the facts. You say what they did. You explain why it mattered. You imagine the moment they finally understand. And underneath all of this is a deep longing to be seen. The mind is not simply trying to argue. It is trying to restore dignity. It is trying to recover the voice that betrayal stole. It is trying to say, what happened to me mattered. My pain was real. I was not wrong for hurting. This is why imaginary conversations can feel so addictive. They touch a real emotional need, the need to be heard, the need to be understood, the need to correct a false version of the story, the need to speak the truth after being silenced. But Buddhist wisdom asks a painful and liberating question. Does this inner argument truly free you, or does it keep you tied to the person through thought? That question changes everything. Because sometimes the mind keeps rehearsing arguments, not because healing is happening, but because the wound is still seeking recognition from the same source that wounded it. The body is asking for safety, the heart is asking for justice, the ego is asking for victory, but awareness begins to see that no imaginary conversation can truly give what only inner release can provide. The person may be absent, but the attachment remains alive through mental speech. This is one of the hidden ways betrayal continues after the relationship ends. The external betrayal may be finished, but the internal relationship continues through thought. Every imagined argument brings the person back into your inner space. Every rehearsed speech gives them another chair in your mind. Every fantasy of being finally understood keeps your peace connected to their imagined reaction. And slowly, the mind becomes a place where the past keeps returning. Not because you are weak, not because you enjoy suffering, but because the nervous system is trying to complete something that felt emotionally unsafe, unfair, or unfinished. Betrayal often creates a deep break in reality. You thought you knew someone, then their actions revealed another side. You trusted a version of the relationship, then reality changed suddenly. The mind struggles to adjust because betrayal does not only hurt the heart, it also damages the sense of what is true. So the brain begins rehearsing. It rehearses what should have been said. It rehearses what should have happened. It rehearses how the other person should have responded. It rehearses the justice that never came. This rehearsal is the mind's attempt to reorganize emotional chaos. But there comes a point where rehearsal stops helping and starts trapping. A person may spend months mentally preparing for a conversation that will never happen. They perfect words they may never speak. They imagine responses they may never receive. They create emotional scenes that briefly satisfy the ego but leave the nervous system restless afterward. And because the relief is temporary, the mind returns again later. This becomes a cycle. The wound feels painful. The mind creates an imaginary conversation. The conversation gives temporary control. The control fades. The wound returns. The mind creates another conversation. This is how inner arguments become emotional loops. Buddhism teaches that the mind is constantly generating thoughts, stories, images, and reactions. Most of these arise automatically from fear, craving, anger, memory, and attachment. Without awareness, a person believes every thought deserves attention. They follow every mental argument as if it is important. They enter every imagined conversation as if it will finally bring peace. But awareness begins to notice something deeper. A thought can appear without needing to be continued. An argument can rise without needing to be rehearsed. A memory can visit without needing to become a full emotional drama. This is not easy at first because betrayal gives the mind strong fuel. Anger has energy, hurt has energy, injustice has energy, silence has energy. And when that energy has nowhere to go, the mind turns it into imaginary speech. It says, if I could just make them understand. If I could just explain one more time. If I could just show them what they did. But behind those sentences is often an old pain asking for validation. And this is where healing must become tender. You cannot shame yourself for having imaginary conversations. They are often the mind's way of trying to protect you from emotional helplessness. They arise when something inside still feels unheard. They arise when truth was denied. They arise when a person left you carrying words with nowhere to put them. So the goal is not to attack the mind. The goal is to understand it, then gently stop obeying it. You can notice the imaginary conversation and say, this is my pain trying to speak. That awareness changes the relationship immediately. Instead of being swallowed by the argument, you begin witnessing it. You see the hurt underneath the mental noise. You see the part of you still wanting someone else to recognize your suffering. And once you see it clearly, you can give that recognition to yourself. This is deeply important because many inner arguments continue only because the wounded person has not yet fully validated their own experience. Part of them still waits for the betrayer to confirm the truth. But your pain does not need their agreement to be real. Your memory does not need their confession to matter. Your heart does not need their emotional maturity before it deserves compassion. When self-validation begins, the need for imaginary arguments slowly weakens, not instantly, but slowly. The mind may still return to old speeches, but awareness now meets them differently. Instead of saying, "Let me rehearse this again," awareness says, I already know what hurt me. I do not need to keep proving it inside my own head. That sentence is powerful, because many imaginary conversations are attempts to prove pain that is already valid. The mind keeps presenting evidence, but to whom? The other person is not there. The past is not changing. The internal courtroom keeps reopening, but no final verdict brings peace. At some point, awareness must close the court inside the mind and stop putting your heart on trial. This is a deep spiritual act. It means you stop needing the betrayer's imagined understanding before trusting your own truth. It means you no longer rehearse pain to make it legitimate. It means you release the exhausting need to win an argument inside your own head. Because even if you win mentally, the nervous system still loses when the wound is reactivated. This is why the spiritual reason behind imaginary conversations is attachment. The mind remains attached not only to the person, but to a certain outcome. It wants them to understand. It wants them to regret. It wants them to admit. It wants them to become conscious. It wants the story to finally turn in your favor. And these desires are human, but when they become constant, they keep suffering alive. Buddhist wisdom does not deny the human desire for justice. It simply shows that inner peace cannot depend on mentally forcing justice to happen in a private theater of thought. Real peace grows when the mind stops creating endless scenes to compensate for what reality did not provide. This is not the same as silence. It is not the same as weakness. It is not the same as letting harm disappear. It is choosing not to let harm keep reproducing itself inside your mind every day. Because each imaginary argument may feel like speaking truth. But if it leaves you tense, angry, sleepless, and emotionally drained, it may no longer be truth-serving healing. It may be pain repeating itself. The difference matters. Truth brings clarity. Rumination brings agitation. Truth helps you stand. Rumination keeps you circling. Truth gives dignity. Rumination keeps asking the wound to perform again. And awareness learns to feel the difference in the body. After a healthy reflection, the body may feel sad but clearer. After an obsessive imaginary argument, the body often feels tight, heated, restless, and emotionally exhausted. That physical response tells you something. The mind may claim it is helping, but the body reveals the cost. This is why returning to the body matters during healing. When an imaginary conversation begins, feel where it lands. The throat, the chest, the stomach, the jaw, the shoulders. Notice the tension, notice the breath, notice how quickly the body prepares for a fight that is not happening in the present moment. The betrayal is remembered, but the body reacts as if the danger is alive again. This is how the past keeps entering the present through thought. Awareness gently brings you back. It says, this is a memory, this is a thought, this is not happening now. These simple words can slowly train the nervous system to stop confusing mental replay with present reality. And over time, the imaginary conversations lose some force. They may still appear, especially when you are tired, lonely, triggered, or emotionally raw. But they do not have to become your home. You can let them pass like sounds outside a window. Heard, but not followed. Present, but not obeyed. This is a practice, not a one-time decision. The mind that rehearsed arguments for months or years needs gentle repetition to learn a new path. Each time you do not continue the imaginary conversation, you weaken the old pattern. Each time you return to breath, body, and present awareness, you strengthen inner freedom. This is how healing becomes practical. Not by demanding perfect peace immediately, but by making small choices inside the mind again and again. There is another reason people mentally rehearse arguments after betrayal. They fear being misunderstood forever. Betrayal often comes with distortion. The other person may have blamed you, lied about you, minimized your pain, or acted as if your reaction was the problem. This creates a deep urge to correct the record. The mind says, they cannot get away with believing that. They need to know the truth. They need to understand what really happened. This urge is understandable. Being misrepresented hurts deeply, but inner peace becomes impossible when your emotional freedom depends on correcting every false version of you that exists in another person's mind. Some people will misunderstand you because understanding you would require them to face themselves. Some will rewrite the story because truth threatens their comfort. Some will make you the villain because guilt is easier to carry when it is projected outward. You cannot live inside every mind, correcting every distortion. This is where Buddhist freedom becomes powerful. It teaches you to return to your own awareness instead of becoming trapped inside other people's perceptions. The question slowly changes from, how do I make them understand, to, can I remain peaceful even if they never do? That question is not easy, but it is liberating. Because the moment you stop needing every person to carry the correct version of your story, your inner life becomes lighter. You know what happened. You know what you felt. You know what you learned. You know where your conscience stands. That must begin to matter more than the fantasy of winning an argument inside someone else's mind. Imaginary conversations also continue because anger often protects grief. It is easier to rehearse sharp words than to feel the raw sadness underneath. Anger gives energy. Grief asks for softness. Anger says, they were wrong. Grief says, I was hurt, and I wish things had been different. Many people unconsciously choose anger because grief feels too vulnerable, so the mind keeps arguing. But beneath the argument is often a heart that simply needs to mourn. This is why some imaginary conversations disappear only after the person finally lets themselves feel sadness without turning it into a fight. Not collapse, not despair, just honest mourning. Mourning the trust that was broken. Mourning the version of the person you thought you knew. Mourning the future you expected. Mourning the words that never came. When grief is allowed, anger often softens, and when anger softens, the imaginary arguments lose energy. This is why healing requires courage. It takes courage to stop fighting in your head and feel what the fight was protecting. It takes courage to admit that behind the perfect speech was a wounded place asking to be held. It takes courage to stop chasing imaginary victory and choose real peace instead. At some point, the mind must understand that the final conversation it keeps creating may never need to happen outside. It may need to happen within. Not a conversation with the betrayer, but with the wounded part of yourself. You may need to say, I believe you. What happened mattered. You do not need to keep proving your pain. You are safe to stop arguing now. You can release the speech you were never given the chance to say. These words may feel simple, but they reach the part of the heart that was still waiting to be heard. And slowly, the inner courtroom becomes quiet. Not because the betrayal was excused, not because the other person was right, not because justice became unnecessary, but because your soul no longer wants to spend its life rehearsing arguments with someone who is not present enough to receive the truth. That is freedom. The freedom to stop performing your pain in the theater of thought. The freedom to stop inviting the betrayer into your mind every night. The freedom to stop confusing mental victory with emotional healing. And when that freedom begins, the silence inside no longer feels empty. It begins to feel like space. Space for rest. Space for breath. Space for your own life to return. Because the mind can only become peaceful when it stops using itself as a battlefield for conversations that reality has already ended. And slowly, after enough inner arguments, enough emotional replay, and enough nights spent mentally fighting people who are no longer present, another truth begins to rise quietly inside awareness. Not every painful interaction came from pure malice. Not every wound was created by someone sitting calmly and consciously deciding to destroy you. Many people move through life deeply asleep inside themselves, driven by fears, wounds, impulses, and unconscious suffering they barely understand. And this is where one of the deepest Buddhist lessons begins to change the way conflict is seen. There is an old Buddhist image, often called the lesson of the empty boat. A man is sitting peacefully in a small boat on a quiet river. Suddenly another boat crashes into him. Anger immediately rises. He prepares to shout, to accuse, to defend himself. But when he looks closely, he realizes the other boat is empty. No one is inside steering it. And suddenly the anger changes. Because when there is no person intentionally attacking him, the mind no longer personalizes the collision in the same way. This lesson holds enormous wisdom about human conflict. Many painful interactions in life are like collisions with empty boats. People hurt others while driven by unconscious suffering, unresolved fear, emotional blindness, insecurity, shame, confusion, loneliness, ego, trauma, or inner chaos they have never learned to face consciously. Their actions still create pain. The collision still hurts. But awareness slowly begins to understand that much of human suffering spreads through unconsciousness rather than deliberate cruelty alone. This realization does not erase boundaries. It does not excuse abuse. It does not deny pain. But it changes the emotional burden the heart carries afterward. Because one of the deepest causes of suffering is personalization. The mind immediately interprets painful interactions as deeply personal attacks against identity. Someone becomes cold, and the mind says, "I am unwanted." Someone lies, and the mind says, "I was not enough." Someone betrays trust, and the mind says, "I was foolish to believe in them." But many people are acting from inner storms that existed long before they met you. This is one of the hardest truths to fully accept. Human beings often carry enormous unconscious suffering internally. Some are deeply afraid of abandonment. Some are terrified of intimacy. Some are consumed by shame. Some are emotionally numb from old pain. Some live in constant insecurity. Some never learned how to regulate emotions. Some mistake control for love. Some fear vulnerability so deeply they destroy closeness the moment it becomes real. And because these wounds remain unconscious, they spill outward into relationships. This is why people often hurt others while believing they are protecting themselves. A person afraid of rejection may reject first. A person terrified of honesty may lie automatically. A person drowning in insecurity may become controlling. A person carrying self-hatred may sabotage love because receiving love feels unsafe. And the painful part is that many people do not fully realize they are doing this while it happens. They are being driven by inner suffering they never stopped to understand. This is the lesson of the empty boat. When someone crashes emotionally into your life, awareness slowly begins asking a different question, not "Why are they attacking me personally?" but "What unconscious suffering may be steering this behavior?" That shift changes the emotional atmosphere completely. Again, this does not mean harmful behavior becomes acceptable. The boat still hit you. The pain still matters. Boundaries still matter deeply. But awareness stops adding unnecessary emotional poison through personalization. Because personalization multiplies suffering. The ego constantly interprets events through identity. They disrespected me because I am worthless. They abandoned me because I am unlovable. They betrayed me because I was weak. But often people are acting from internal confusion that has little to do with your deepest worth. This realization creates compassion, but not weak compassion. Clear compassion. The kind that understands wounded people often wound others unconsciously. The kind that sees emotional chaos spreading from person to person because so few human beings truly know themselves deeply. There is enormous freedom in realizing not every painful interaction is a carefully targeted judgment against your value. Sometimes you are simply standing in the path of another person's unresolved suffering. This becomes especially important after betrayal because betrayal creates intense personalization. The wounded mind obsesses over what the betrayal says about them. They search for flaws within themselves. They compare themselves endlessly. They wonder what they lacked. But awareness begins seeing a larger picture. Many betrayals grow from fear, emotional immaturity, unresolved wounds, or unconscious behavior patterns that existed long before the relationship began. The betrayer may not even fully understand why they behaved the way they did. This does not erase accountability, but it softens self-destruction, because the wounded person no longer carries the entire emotional burden alone. They stop interpreting another person's unconsciousness as objective truth about themselves. One reason the lesson of the empty boat is so powerful is because it interrupts reactive anger. Most suffering after conflict comes not only from the original event, but from the emotional chain reaction afterward. The mind keeps replaying the offense, building resentment, imagining revenge, rehearsing arguments, and deepening emotional poison internally. But when awareness sees unconscious suffering behind behavior, the emotional reaction begins changing. Anger softens slightly into understanding. Hatred softens slightly into clarity. Personalization softens slightly into compassion. Again, not passive tolerance, not emotional weakness, simply freedom from carrying unnecessary emotional fire inside yourself forever. Many people confuse forgiveness with pretending nothing painful happened. But Buddhist compassion is much deeper than denial. It sees suffering honestly. It sees damage honestly. But it also sees that unconscious people often spread suffering because they themselves are trapped inside suffering. An angry person often carries hidden pain. A controlling person often carries fear. A manipulative person often carries deep insecurity. An emotionally avoidant person often carries unresolved shame. A cruel person often carries emotional numbness or buried wounds. And because they never faced these inner states consciously, they unconsciously pass them outward. This is why suffering spreads so easily between human beings. One wounded person creates another wounded person. One emotionally neglected person creates more emotional neglect. One betrayed person may later struggle to trust. One abandoned person may later abandon others first. Without awareness, suffering keeps reproducing itself endlessly. This is why Buddhism places so much importance on awakening consciousness itself. Awareness interrupts unconscious cycles. Instead of automatically reacting from pain, awareness begins observing pain clearly. And this changes conflict completely. A person insults you. Without awareness, anger immediately explodes. With awareness, something pauses internally. You begin noticing, this reaction may be coming from their suffering. This anger may not actually be about me. This person may be colliding with me emotionally because they themselves are lost. That pause creates enormous freedom, because for the first time, another person's unconsciousness does not automatically become your emotional prison. Most people live reactively. Someone criticizes them and self-worth collapses. Someone withdraws emotionally and panic begins. Someone behaves coldly and the mind immediately personalizes it. But awareness gradually learns how to separate another person's suffering from your identity. This takes practice because the ego naturally wants to defend itself. The ego says, How dare they treat me this way? How could they do this to me? They ruined my peace. And maybe their behavior truly was harmful. But awareness notices something deeper. If another person is deeply unconscious internally, expecting fully conscious behavior from them may create endless suffering. The ego wants emotionally immature people to suddenly behave with wisdom, empathy, accountability, and self-awareness. But many people simply have not developed those capacities yet. This realization feels painful at first because it removes fantasy. The fantasy says, if they truly loved me, they would become emotionally aware. If they cared enough, they would understand. If I explain myself better, they will finally change. But unconscious suffering cannot always be reasoned with easily. Some people must lose relationships repeatedly before recognizing their own patterns. Some avoid introspection their entire lives. Some remain emotionally asleep for decades. And waiting for another person's awakening before allowing yourself peace creates enormous suffering. The lesson of the empty boat frees the heart from this trap slowly. You stop demanding complete emotional consciousness from people trapped inside their own unconscious pain. You stop expecting emotional maturity from deeply emotionally fragmented individuals. And strangely, this creates less bitterness. Because bitterness often depends on believing the other person acted with total conscious intention and clarity. But awareness begins seeing how confused, reactive, wounded, fearful, and internally chaotic many people truly are. Again, this does not erase consequences. A harmful action still matters, boundaries still matter. Leaving harmful situations still matters. But hatred softens because awareness sees suffering beneath behavior. This changes how the nervous system carries memory too. Without awareness, painful memories remain filled with emotional poison. The mind replays betrayal while fueling rage endlessly. But awareness begins seeing the humanity underneath the behavior. Brokenness, fear, emotional blindness, confusion. And while the pain may still exist, the emotional burden gradually lightens because the mind no longer carries the same level of personalized hatred. This is one reason compassion becomes spiritually liberating. Compassion is not primarily for the other person. It protects your own heart from becoming permanently poisoned by resentment. Resentment feels powerful temporarily because it gives the ego certainty and identity. But internally, it creates enormous suffering. The body stays tense, the mind stays reactive. Emotional energy remains trapped in the past. The lesson of the empty boat slowly dissolves this attachment, not through denial, not through forced positivity, but through deeper understanding of human suffering itself. Human beings are often deeply unconscious creatures trying to survive emotional pain they barely understand. Most people are reacting far more than they are consciously living. They chase comfort, avoid discomfort, protect identity, seek validation, escape shame, fear abandonment, fear rejection, fear intimacy, fear vulnerability. And all these unconscious fears shape behavior constantly. This understanding changes how conflict feels internally. Instead of seeing every painful interaction as proof you are under attack personally, awareness begins seeing wounded nervous systems colliding with each other unconsciously. Two frightened people arguing, two wounded people misunderstanding each other, two egos defending themselves, two nervous systems reacting from old pain. This perspective creates humility too, because eventually awareness notices, I have also acted unconsciously before. I have also reacted from fear before. I have also spread pain while carrying pain. This realization softens judgment, not because all behavior becomes equal, but because human suffering itself becomes easier to recognize universally. There is another hidden freedom inside the empty boat lesson. It reduces emotional obsession with fairness. The ego constantly wants emotional accounting. They hurt me, so they must suffer too. They wronged me, so life must correct them. But awareness begins understanding that unconscious people are already suffering internally, even if it is hidden beneath distraction, ego, arrogance, numbness, or avoidance. A person disconnected from themselves cannot experience lasting peace fully. A person ruled by fear cannot experience true freedom fully. A person trapped in ego cannot experience deep intimacy fully. Unconsciousness itself creates suffering automatically. This realization weakens the desire for revenge gradually, because awareness sees that life itself already carries consequences inside human consciousness. Some consequences are external, others are internal, and internal suffering often remains invisible. The lesson of the empty boat also helps release emotional hypervigilance. After betrayal or conflict, many people become overly alert to future harm. They assume everyone intends to hurt them personally. The nervous system stays defensive constantly. But awareness begins understanding that many painful interactions are not carefully targeted attacks. Often they are unconscious emotional collisions between wounded human beings. This softens fear slightly. The world stops feeling like a battlefield filled entirely with malicious enemies. Instead, awareness sees a world filled with suffering people trying unsuccessfully to escape their own pain. And this understanding creates sadness but also compassion, because underneath so much conflict lives simple human suffering, loneliness, fear, insecurity, unhealed trauma, emotional neglect, shame, confusion. People rarely say, "I am deeply afraid." Instead, they become controlling. People rarely say, "I feel emotionally unsafe." Instead, they become avoidant. People rarely say, "I hate myself." Instead, they become cruel. Unconscious suffering disguises itself constantly, and awareness begins seeing through the disguises. This does not mean you stay close to harmful people. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Buddhism never teaches emotional self-abandonment. Sometimes the healthiest action is distance. Sometimes compassion means walking away peacefully instead of continuing cycles of suffering. But even distance feels different when hatred no longer dominates the heart completely. You leave with clarity instead of poison. You protect yourself without needing revenge. You understand suffering without becoming trapped inside it. This is emotional maturity, the rare ability to recognize another person's unconscious suffering without turning their behavior into the center of your identity. And slowly, conflict itself begins changing shape internally. You stop carrying every insult forever. You stop personalizing every emotional collision completely. You stop demanding emotionally unconscious people behave with perfect awareness. Instead, you begin seeing the empty boats everywhere. The angry stranger, the emotionally unavailable partner, the manipulative parent, the cold friend, the dishonest person, the reactive co-worker. So many people drifting through life unconsciously, colliding with others while barely understanding themselves. And strangely, this realization softens the heart instead of hardening it. Because now you understand something deeply important. Most people are not fighting you personally as much as they are fighting the unresolved suffering inside themselves. And once you fully see that, your own inner world becomes quieter, not because pain disappears, but because you stop carrying unnecessary emotional warfare inside your heart. That is the freedom hidden inside the lesson of the empty boat. And slowly, after beginning to see how unconscious suffering shapes so much of human conflict, another truth quietly emerges from beneath the pain. Even when someone hurt you unconsciously, abandoned you carelessly, or left your heart carrying unfinished emotions, suffering continues to grow when your peace still depends on them. The moment your healing requires their apology, their honesty, their explanation, or their emotional awakening, your inner world remains tied to their behavior. And this is where emotional dependence hides most deeply. There is a painful kind of waiting that many people never recognize clearly. It is not always visible from the outside. A person may continue working, smiling, speaking normally, and living their life, while internally part of them remains emotionally paused, waiting for a message, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for accountability, waiting for one final conversation that will finally allow the heart to relax. And because of this waiting, their peace remains in someone else's hands. This is one of the hardest Buddhist lessons to fully accept. As long as your healing requires another person's participation, your inner freedom remains unstable. Your emotional state rises and falls according to their awareness, their choices, their responses, and their level of consciousness. And that creates enormous suffering. Many people believe they are simply seeking closure, but beneath that search is often a deeper emotional dependency. The mind says, "I cannot fully move on until they explain. I cannot fully heal until they apologize. I cannot fully rest until they understand what they did." And while these desires feel understandable, they quietly place your peace outside yourself. This is why closure becomes emotionally dangerous when it turns into dependence. Because now your nervous system is waiting for another human being to become emotionally available enough to free you from pain. And human beings are unpredictable. Some never become self-aware. Some avoid accountability forever. Some remain trapped inside ego, shame, confusion, or emotional immaturity their entire lives. If your healing depends on their awakening, your suffering may continue indefinitely. This realization feels devastating at first because the heart naturally wants mutual resolution. Human beings long for emotional repair. They want pain to be acknowledged. They want relationships to end with honesty and understanding. They want emotional reality to be shared. But life does not always provide that. And emotional maturity begins the moment you realize peace cannot permanently depend on what another person chooses to do with their consciousness. This changes the entire direction of healing. Instead of endlessly asking, "Will they ever understand?" awareness slowly begins asking, "How much longer do I want my peace controlled by someone else's awareness?" That question is life-changing, because many people unknowingly give enormous emotional authority to those who hurt them. The person may no longer even be present physically, yet internally they still control emotional weather. One memory changes the mood completely. One imagined conversation creates emotional collapse. One unanswered message determines whether peace feels possible that day. This is emotional captivity. The wounded person keeps waiting for emotional permission to finally feel okay again. But Buddhist wisdom gently points toward another path. Inner freedom begins when healing becomes an inward process instead of an emotional negotiation with another person's consciousness. This does not mean pretending the pain never mattered. It does not mean denying the need for accountability. It does not mean becoming emotionally detached or cold. It means realizing your healing cannot remain permanently hostage to another person's emotional capacity. This distinction is deeply important, because some people will never become capable of giving the closure you hoped for, not because your pain lacked importance, but because their inner world lacks the depth, stability, courage, or awareness required for real accountability. And if your peace waits forever for their transformation, your life becomes emotionally suspended. This suspension creates quiet suffering. The body moves through daily life, but emotionally part of the heart remains standing beside an unfinished doorway, listening, hoping, watching, waiting for them to finally understand, waiting for them to finally admit the truth, waiting for them to finally care enough. And meanwhile, life keeps moving. This is why needing closure often creates hidden emotional dependency long after relationships end. The attachment no longer looks like love externally. It looks like emotional waiting. The nervous system remains connected through unfinished expectation. This expectation drains enormous emotional energy because the mind constantly monitors possibility. Maybe they will reach out someday. Maybe they finally regret it. Maybe they will explain eventually. And each possibility keeps the emotional attachment active. Buddhist teachings constantly return to non-attachment because attachment keeps awareness trapped in emotional dependence. The suffering is not only coming from what happened anymore, it is coming from the continued belief that peace exists somewhere inside another person's future behavior. This belief quietly steals power from the self. A person stops trusting their own ability to heal independently. They unconsciously believe emotional freedom must be granted externally instead of cultivated internally. And this creates fear too. Because if your peace depends on someone else's response, then your emotional stability becomes permanently fragile. One ignored message can destroy your mood. One disappointing interaction can reopen old wounds. One reminder of their indifference can collapse emotional progress. This is why dependency feels so exhausting internally. The nervous system never fully rests because it remains emotionally tied to uncertainty outside itself. There is a hidden grief inside recognizing this truth. Many people do not want to admit how much emotional power they have given away. They do not want to realize that even after betrayal, abandonment, or rejection, they still emotionally orbit around the person who hurt them. But awareness must see this clearly before freedom becomes possible, because once you see the dependence honestly, something shifts internally. You begin realizing, I have been waiting for them to free me. I have been waiting for them to restore my peace. I have been waiting for them to become conscious enough for me to finally heal. And suddenly, the deeper suffering becomes visible. Not only the original wound, but the continued surrender of inner authority afterward. This is where healing begins turning inward again. The mind slowly starts understanding something powerful. Your peace becomes unstable whenever it depends entirely on another person behaving correctly. Human beings are too unpredictable, too wounded, too unconscious, too emotionally inconsistent for your entire inner life to rest safely inside their choices. This does not mean isolation. It means emotional sovereignty. Emotional sovereignty means your healing eventually belongs to you again, not because other people's actions stop mattering, but because your nervous system no longer waits helplessly for their participation before allowing peace to return. This realization feels almost impossible at first because emotionally wounded people naturally crave external repair. After betrayal, abandonment, manipulation, or emotional neglect, the heart desperately wants acknowledgement. It wants the person who created the pain to help resolve it. And sometimes healthy accountability absolutely helps healing. But awareness eventually recognizes a painful reality. Not every person is emotionally equipped to participate in healing the pain they created. Some are too avoidant, some are too defensive, some are too ashamed, some are too emotionally disconnected from themselves. And waiting endlessly for emotionally unavailable people to suddenly become emotionally conscious creates ongoing suffering. There comes a moment during healing when the heart grows tired. Tired of waiting, tired of hoping, tired of monitoring another person's awareness constantly. Tired of giving emotional control away repeatedly, and this exhaustion can become sacred. Because eventually the soul asks, what if I stop waiting? What if my peace no longer depends on them? What if healing begins the moment I stop emotionally chasing participation from someone unwilling or unable to provide it? These questions mark the beginning of liberation. Not dramatic liberation, quiet liberation. The kind that slowly returns emotional energy back to the self. Because every day spent waiting for someone else's awareness is energy pulled away from your own life. Attention stays trapped in the emotional past instead of returning fully to the present. This is why Buddhist practice emphasizes returning awareness inward repeatedly, not in a selfish way, in a freeing way. The breath belongs to you. The present moment belongs to you. Awareness belongs to you. Your inner life belongs to you, and slowly the heart begins reclaiming itself. This process does not happen all at once. Emotional dependency often runs deep because attachment creates psychological habits. The mind is used to emotionally checking the other person constantly, even internally. What are they thinking? Do they regret it? Will they ever understand? Do they miss me? Do they know how badly I was hurt? But awareness gradually notices something important. None of these questions create peace. They create emotional tethering. The nervous system stays psychologically connected to someone else's inner world instead of grounding inside its own healing process. This is why true healing requires releasing the fantasy that another person's awareness is the missing key to your freedom. That fantasy keeps suffering alive. Because the fantasy says, once they finally become conscious, I can rest. Once they finally admit the truth, I can breathe. Once they finally apologize correctly, I can move on. But awareness eventually sees the danger hidden inside this belief. Your peace remains permanently vulnerable whenever it depends on someone else becoming different. And human beings often remain exactly who they are for very long periods of time. This realization creates sadness at first because it removes hope in external rescue. But underneath that sadness lives enormous freedom, because now healing no longer waits. You stop postponing your life emotionally. You stop delaying peace until someone else evolves. You stop sacrificing your nervous system while waiting for emotional permission to heal. Instead, awareness begins building peace directly within the present moment. This changes the body too. The nervous system slowly stops monitoring the other person constantly. The emotional anticipation weakens, the obsessive mental checking softens, the emotional dependency loosens slightly, and with that loosening comes relief. Not because the past disappears, but because the emotional leash begins breaking. Many people do not realize how much emotional energy dependency consumes until they finally release it. Suddenly the mind feels quieter, the body feels lighter. Emotional space begins opening. This space matters deeply because healing requires internal room to breathe. As long as attention remains fixated on another person's awareness, very little energy remains available for genuine self-reconnection. The heart stays externally focused, but once emotional dependency weakens, awareness begins returning home. You start noticing your own needs again, your own exhaustion, your own healing, your own life, your own future. And this return inward feels unfamiliar at first, because emotional attachment trained the mind to look outward constantly. Buddhist wisdom often describes attachment as a form of grasping. The mind reaches outward, trying to secure certainty, comfort, validation, or resolution through external conditions. But suffering grows whenever peace becomes dependent on unstable external factors. Human beings themselves are unstable. Emotions are unstable. Relationships are unstable. Awareness levels are unstable. This is why inner freedom must eventually develop independently from other people's participation. Not independently from love, not independently from connection, but independently from emotional dependency. This distinction changes relationships entirely. You can still desire accountability without emotionally collapsing if it never comes. You can still value honesty without sacrificing your life waiting for it. You can still feel hurt without handing someone permanent authority over your peace. This is emotional maturity, the rare ability to acknowledge pain fully while refusing to let another person permanently govern your inner world. And once this understanding deepens, the heart begins relaxing differently. The waiting softens, the chasing softens, the obsession softens. Because now awareness understands. My healing cannot depend entirely on someone else's consciousness. My peace cannot remain trapped inside their choices forever. My life cannot stay emotionally paused while waiting for another person to awaken. This realization creates strength, quiet strength, stable strength, inner strength, the kind that no longer begs emotionally unavailable people to participate in your liberation. And strangely, this strength often feels gentler than anger ever did, because anger still keeps the emotional bond alive through resistance. Dependency keeps the emotional bond alive through waiting. But inner freedom slowly releases both, not through force, not through suppression, through awareness, finally understanding that your soul deserves peace, even if another person never becomes capable of giving you the closure you once hoped for. That is where healing truly begins, the moment your inner world stops asking someone else for permission to finally be free. And in the end, the deepest freedom was never hidden inside another person's apology, explanation, or return. It was hidden inside your ability to stop chasing peace through people who were never capable of giving it consistently. Throughout these lessons, you saw how the mind replays old conversations, how emotional wounds reopen through attachment, how ghosting and betrayal create confusion, and how unconscious suffering shapes so much of human behavior. But you also discovered something deeper. Healing begins the moment you stop waiting for emotionally unavailable people to complete your inner world. Some people will never explain themselves clearly because they do not even understand themselves clearly. Some stories will never end with justice, honesty, or perfect closure, and yet your life still deserves peace. Your heart still deserves rest. Your soul still deserves freedom from endless emotional waiting. Real inner freedom begins when you no longer need another person's awareness before allowing yourself to heal. It begins when you stop reopening old wounds, searching for answers that cannot give you the peace you are already capable of building within yourself. And slowly, as attachment softens, something beautiful returns. Stillness, clarity, breathing room inside the heart again. If this message reached a part of you that has been silently carrying unfinished pain, leave a comment below with the words, "I release what no longer gives me peace." Sometimes one sentence becomes the beginning of emotional freedom for someone else reading too. And if you want more teachings that help you heal quietly, think deeply, and